The August 30th Planning Board meeting to order. We are continuing our deliberations on the special permit application of Chabaco Hill Capital Partners, LLC, as well as their application for a stormwater management permit. So our first order of business is roll call. So when I call your name, will you please indicate that you're present for the benefit of the people who are attending via Zoom?
Yes.
Rick Mitchell,
Aye. Here.
Richard Boroff,
Here.
Jonathan Poor,
Jonathan Poor, present.
Emil Dahlquist,
Emil Dahlquist here.
Bill Wheaton,
Bill Wheaton here.
Pat Norton,
Pat Norton here.
and Marnie Crouch here. And Corey Beaulieu, are you here via Zoom?
I am, yes. Corey Beaulieu here via Zoom.
Thank you. So for the benefit of the attendees via Zoom, all the members present except for Corey Beaulieu are entitled to vote on the applications that are before us. So at this point, I just want to recap a little bit about...
Why isn't, he should be able to vote even if, shouldn't he?
He's an alternate now.
He's an alternate, he's an
Oh,
associate.
okay, I'm sorry. I
He can vote if somebody drops out.
Right.
Yeah.
So I wanted to recap just a little bit about what we did at the last meeting. We did review some of the pertinent town documents, including the 2004 master plan, the 2009 open space and recreation plan, the 2019 housing production plan, and the open space residential development or conservation subdivision model bylaw, which formed the basis of our open space and farmland preservation development bylaw. And at the last meeting, we endeavored to parse out the relationship of the development to the natural environment with a goal of resolving one important question, a fundamental question, and that is whether this project is ecologically responsible. And among other questions that we debated is whether this project is integrated with the site or imposed upon it. In conjunction with our discussions, we did refer to the stormwater management plan, and that precipitated a discussion of the role of peer reviewers. And clearly, we must rely on peer reviewers when those peer reviewers opine on subjects that are well outside of our area of expertise. But that being said, the peer reviewers inform our decisions, but they can't dictate our decisions, because our job as members of the planning board is to review the project in very broad, in broad terms, holistically. So the peer reviewers opine on very specific topics, but not, and it would be inappropriate were they to do so, on the appropriateness of the project as a whole. And then one or two final comments. In speaking of stormwater management, we have to be careful to differentiate between the stormwater permit application, which has one set of standards, and section 8.2.20, which I will just read because that is, again, part of the senior housing bylaw that we should be mindful of. And that particular provision provides the following. The peak rate of stormwater runoff from a senior housing development shall comply with Department of Environmental Protection stormwater management policy and the provisions of General Bylaw 29. So that's a very expert-oriented consideration. And then it goes on. Stormwater, general soil erosion of the proposed development site shall be minimized by integrating the development into the existing terrain and by reasonably retaining natural grades and soil cover. During grading and construction of all improvements, including all structures and infrastructure improvements, erosion of soil shall be minimized using best management practices. So you see that bylaw really has two aspects to it. One sort of directed at the expertise of peer reviewers, and the other more toward the general knowledge and information that the planning board members will bring to the discussion. And then tonight, I'm hoping we can get through the remaining two broad categories that we outlined in the memorandum that you all received prior to the last meeting, namely the relationship of the development to the site and the relationship of the development to the neighborhood and the community. And also, at the conclusion of that discussion, I invite any planning board member to identify any questions that they may have about this development that remain unanswered, or whether they simply don't know about some aspect of this project that is pertinent to their thinking in making up their minds. So if we could accomplish all that, then I did identify a number of sections of the senior housing bylaw that I don't consider to be outcome determinative, and perhaps we could just briefly run through them, and if anybody disagrees with my list, they can point that out, and we can then advance any particular subsection of the senior housing bylaw forward to have a more detailed discussion. But as I said at the last meeting, there are many items that are just not subject to dispute, and one of which is an important one, is the payment of $2,174,000 to the Affordable Housing Trust, as well as some of the other provisions of the bylaw, such as the distance from other senior housing projects. They're just not in dispute and wouldn't tip the scale one way or the other in terms of decision-making. And following that, we can then discuss our agenda for September 8th. And any amendments to our schedule, if that's warranted, in view of some vacations. Excuse me. So turning to the relationship of this development to site conditions, we identified a number of topics. I want to set forth what I consider an overriding question that we don't have to answer prior to our discussions, but that we should keep in mind. And that is, do the applicant's plans reflect the consideration of site conditions for the intended use of the site for senior housing? And just for the edification of all participants, our senior housing bylaw defines elderly as 55 plus. And for all of us who are over 55, or if they're 55, I'm not sure they would want to be considered elderly, but that's the definition. No one wants to be considered elderly, even if they are. So our first discussion topic is aging in place, and so the question I have for board members is, what amenities are provided by this development for both social, interactive, and active and passive recreation? If anybody has any comments about that.
I'll begin, I guess, on this. It goes back to that basic question, what is a site plan for? It's to support a particular behavior, which in this case is senior housing. The word amenities came up in one of the bylaws in any case, but we wanted to talk about what ones are there to support life in this particular village. And what occasionally happens, or what happens in many sites, is that senior housing provides facilities because if the elderly like one thing, they like to socialize, and there usually is a place for gathering, either indoors or outdoors. It could be an outdoor plaza, it could be an indoor pavilion or gazebo or something. And that typically, when you see a lot of senior housing projects, that's something that's part of it. Now, it's not required here, that's to be sure, but what it would be it would be a positive consideration, I think, if there were more amenities on the site. For example, like benches along the sidewalks, people who go out for a walk might want to pause occasionally, or if there's a scenic view, just stop, have a seat, and move on there. But they don't have any on the sidewalks. Another nice amenity might be pedestrian handrails along the sidewalks, especially those that exceed ADA standard ramps going down along the side of the road at 10% or 1 in 10 pitch on the side. It's not ADA standards by any means, but it would be helpful, I think, as a safety issue on the site. Another one might be a communal garden. I know that the 40B housing put one up on Asbury Street as part of their presentation. Again, it's not required here, but it would have been a nice thing to do.
What kind of garden, please?
A communal garden, like a victory garden, kind of vegetable kind of place, where the folks could gather and just plant for the season. So it's just an activity that's there. And I suspect maybe some of these would be there, but the site is pretty crowded, so that, would it come at the expense of maybe something else? That probably is the rationale for it. But just to make a note that, I was trying to think of, if you were to walk around this site, what would identify it as a senior site to anybody? And, I think it's pretty well indistinguishable, I think, from a standard subdivision site. Again, not required by the bylaws, but just a comment I wanted to make on that. That's really all I had for the amenities on this project.
Well, a lot of that stuff could be added at any time.
Yep.
It's not really hard cast in stone kind of stuff.
That's right.
And there could be other things that they may decide they want instead.
Sure, that's right.
So, is there a plan for a senior association of any kind? Or is there a community room of sorts for the seniors?
Well, that's it. We were looking at the condominium association. Is there a place for them to gather, to make decisions, to have events? Again, that's typical in a lot of over 55 housing that I've seen. So again, not required, but it would be a good thing to do as part of a senior development.
So would the town be obligated or to provide funding for some of this stuff? Or, okay, I see head shaking, no.
No, it's a private
No.
development.
Okay,
It's pure development material.
okay.
Yeah.
So it'd be basically up to the seniors, once they get there, to decide what they want.
Well, that's one possibility, sure, if they want that.
That would be a strong possibility, I would think.
Mhm.
Well, the next question I have is, do the roadways and sidewalks allow for convenient and safe circulation by residents in all seasons? And in this regard, the attorney for the applicant made several statements. I mean, obviously, this development is pitched toward a younger senior population, 55 plus. So I think all here would agree that 55 that's a younger section of seniors. And I think, really, in other circumstances, seniors are defined as individuals over 62 or over 65. So, but that said, she also indicated that this development is designed for people to age in place. So with that in mind, with aging in place in mind, I'll repeat the question: do roadways and sidewalks allow for convenient and safe circulation by residents in all seasons? And I note that there are portions of the roadways that are at a 10% grade. And our peer reviewer did note that issue, but the applicant is certainly within its rights not to make any alterations to that. That's perfectly legal, but is it conducive to aging in place?
What would be the problem seniors would face? How much of a grade is 10%? I mean, I don't,
Well, if you have a heart condition or you've just had a hip replacement, it's probably pretty significant.
yeah. But how much is 10%? I mean,
It's 1 foot and 10. Just in comparison, the ADA standards, Americans Disability Act standards for a ramp is, it's 1 in 12. So that's a little less, that's like 8% as opposed to 10. But then they also require handrails on both sides of the walk. They give you an allowable 30-foot length before you have to do a flat landing, 5 feet square, and then you start another ramp. So it's a series of intervals of ramps at 12% or 1 in 12 rate. So,
8.5%.
yeah, 8.3, yeah, right,
Yeah.
yeah.
And then the other issue is are there any barrier-free places for people who are in fact aging in place? Certainly, the interior of the homes can be modified, but if someone is in a wheelchair, that would involve enlarging the frame of a door. So I don't know your thoughts on this, because this is senior housing. It is designed for people to age in place.
So wouldn't the developer, when he's building these places, have the doorways big enough for wheelchairs?
Well, I asked the question, they submitted the drawings that were to scale, and I checked out the drawings, and it, first of all, you can't get in the building without going up steps. Now, they did make on the drawings provisions, and they showed in dash lines a potential ramp that could be installed up to the landing in front of the door. They still have to navigate 12 inches there. I asked the architect, and he said, well, we'll just raise up the 6 inches to get you into the door. Okay, and the front door is 3 feet. That's a requirement by code. That's fine for a wheelchair. But once you're inside, the other doors don't comply, getting to a bathroom. And the other critical thing on the interior, and this is sort of out of our realm, but I'm just as an example, is this really barrier-free or aging in place? If the applicant is using that phrase primarily to describe the project aging in place, where people periodically, especially as you get older, might find that they get frail at some points or disabled periodically or temporarily, not just all wind up in a wheelchair, but it's just a convenience around there. But I checked the door widths and I checked the clearances off the latch side of the door, because they all depend, it's all coded. They just say, if the door opens toward you, you need 18 inches off the latch side of the door. If you check the corridors, because Mr. Smith came on to respond to the question, he said, well, we can always make changes in the future, but some of the changes require widening the hallways to get the proper dimension off the latch side of the door. So it's not quite as easy as that, and they may not go through all of that. Again, this is...
But what you're saying is it's better to do it up front at the beginning
Yeah.
rather than later on.
You would think it would be. It is easier to do it up front, correct, right? But again, it's not, it's just a comment about the barrier-free access. I think a bigger issue is what happens on the property in terms of safety. Has been brought out with the steep slopes and so forth around the buildings, behind the buildings, and all of that. The outdoor, especially on lawn, could be pretty dangerous for those who are not sure-footed, going around. Those 2-to-1 slopes is steeper than required for lawns, for example. They have to use a different piece of equipment.
Probably a lot of people will not go outside because it is too steep.
Well,
possibly.
they're not going to be hiking down the slope, that's for sure.
Yeah.
No.
Again, these are kind of objective standards that are not in the bylaw. So we're getting kind of off into a subject area that's really very subjective, and it's not in our bylaw.
Well, interestingly, Rick, in our rules and regulations, which are not so easy to find on the planning board webpage, and the rules and regulations were, I believe, last amended in 2009. So our bylaw has changed, I think, somewhat since then, but not in substance. But there is a rule that says access to open spaces should be barrier-free to serve physically handicapped and the elderly. So that's not a mandate. It's something that's encouraged.
Right.
So
I get
the
it.
one amenity on this property that the applicant has touted is the access to trails. And so where is the access to the trails? The main access to the trail system would be close to Chabaco Road. I don't know if, and maybe the architects among us can tell us whether any of the units have access, have direct access or easy access to the trail system.
A couple of units do, but they're down pretty steep slopes. So I'd just like to mention about the lawns for just a second. Quite a number of the units have steep slopes that separate the front yard from the backyard. So if you needed to walk from the front yard to the backyard, you'd have to navigate a 2-to-1 slope or go indoors and go back outdoors. And a 2-to-1 slope on a lawn, even if there's dew on the grass, tiniest bit of snow, a little bit of ice, wet leaves, is not safe even for able-bodied folks. So I just want to mention that.
Well, I think that we have covered that, that concept, so I think we should move on. Now, smart growth is set forth in one of the purposes of our bylaw, and so I think it's important that we consider smart growth principles. And so the applicant has argued that this project adheres to smart growth principles. And so let's discuss what are smart growth principles. And so
What are smart what?
smart growth principles.
Okay.
Okay, so the Commonwealth of Massachusetts has set forth smart growth principles, and indeed in our bylaws, our planning board rules and regulations in Appendix A, we also list a number of smart growth principles. So I will first read the ones that have been provided by the Commonwealth, and then I will read the ones that our planning board at one point adopted, and we can then discuss which smart growth principles seem to apply to this project and which ones don't. So the Commonwealth has identified the following: concentrate development and mixed uses, advance equity, make efficient decisions, protect land and ecosystems, use natural resources wisely, expand housing opportunities, provide transportation choice, increase jobs and business opportunities, promote clean energy, and plan regionally. Now, obviously, the last one is not particularly relevant here. And in our rules and regulations, the following smart growth principles are set forth. Mixed land uses, take advantage of compact building design, create a range of housing opportunities and choices, create walkable neighborhoods, foster distinctive, attractive communities with a strong sense of place, preserve open space, farmland, natural beauty, and critical environmental areas, encourage development in pre-existing sites rather than greenfields, provide a variety of transportation choices, make development decisions predictable, fair, and cost-effective, encourage community and shareholder collaboration in development decisions. So clearly, the applicant has indicated that it will provide a conservation restriction for open space and farmland. And critical environmental areas, that's the wetland. So I think that given that list, does anyone want to discuss how those smart growth principles apply to this project?
Well, if you read the senior housing purposes, item 3, to encourage the implementation of smart growth techniques to reduce land consumption and sprawl, provide for open space preservation, expand housing options, and encourage the reuse of existing structures, it pretty much meets 3 of the 4 criteria that are listed here.
Well, it's, in terms of transportation, the location of this development is such that if the residents wish to travel into Boston, buy groceries, visit friends, they have to get in a car and drive. So that is one element of this project that really flies in the face of at least a couple of these smart growth principles. And we've already discussed the walkability of this site. So I don't know if there's any further discussion. Clearly,
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, the idea of sprawl that you mentioned in that 8213, this is really an auto-centric development. You can't everybody who leaves that site, 99.9% are going to leave by automobile. The idea in sprawl is to kind of get people maybe living closer to where they actually work. This is located in a remote part of, remote part of Hamilton, fairly close to 128, but still built on undeveloped land, which is another principle in smart growth, which says don't build in raw land or undeveloped land, build in previously developed areas so that you're not taking up new unused land, undeveloped land. So that's where that particular one comes in. So in both cases, it doesn't really pass that test there. So the expand housing options, that same section Rick read, expand housing options. Well, housing options, what does that mean? That means a choice to rent, to buy, have an apartment, condo, freestanding building. So this is a one type house on this site. It's really one model that's being repeated 50 times. So it doesn't really comply with that particular section.
On
So-
the other hand, is it different from models that are in other parts of town?
We're just looking at this project now.
No, I know, but, I mean, are these models, can anybody tell if these models are different from,
I think for senior housing, I think we're going to get into that later in the evening, about senior housing here in town. So if you could just hold that question.
okay?
Thanks.
Well, I think the expanding housing options, the genesis of this was to get away from just single-family housing, which was the only option available at the time that this bylaw was created.
Mhm.
So that's what it meant by expanding housing options as opposed to single-family housing.
Mhm.
So, and to your other comment about, it should be in transportation centers or near commercial centers, well, that would be really great, except there's no land available to do that kind of development downtown. Having been involved in the 1 acre piece of land, only 1 acre of land that was available in the downtown to put any kind of density in. So we have to deal with what we have, which is a very rural setting. And yes, it would be great to put these near transportation and work centers, but that doesn't exist in this town.
I think the question is whether you can use the term smart growth, on the project. When you go item to item and go check them all, I think you're going to find a majority just are not, don't really comply with the smart code techniques. I think that's the gist of this. We could go through them individually if you want, but, I think again, the transportation choice is to kind of promote mass transit. And by building out there as opposed to in town, you can't do it.
Well, and again,
It's-
what we
it's-
have here is, we don't have land available for development in our transportation center. That's why everybody's looking at the MBTA bylaw and kind of laughing at it because it's totally irrational and non-applicable to the downtown. So, yes, all of those things academically would be great, and I don't disagree with that. But we have to deal with what we have, and that's our our land is limited, and it's primarily outside our transportation corridor. So,
That's all true, but we have to evaluate this. Is it a smart growth project or not? Because
well,
that's being
yeah,
used.
but within a
So-
context of the town, not just saying, is it sitting here as a model of smart growth? Well, clearly, it doesn't meet a lot of those criteria because it can't meet those criteria, and it couldn't meet it anywhere in town unless you placed it in the commercial district.
Which
Just
does not have
another
space.
point regarding transportation. CATA, the Cape Area Transportation Authority, does serve the Council on Aging here in Hamilton. They are also likely to be requested to provide services to a 40B that's being proposed on Asbury Street. If there is sufficient demand, I suspect at a project like this that's out of town within a senior housing project environment, I suspect, again, if there's sufficient demand, they'd provide services there too.
Yeah, that's business is business.
Exactly.
Well, is that income dependent, or not? Can you answer that?
Pardon me?
That transportation service, is it income dependent or not?
No, it is not.
So, moving on, it's one of the topics that we should consider are clusters and villages. And,
Clusters and what?
clusters and villages. Everyone has referred to this development as a cluster development, and the applicant has pointed to both the reduced demand on the septic system from the senior housing, as well as the preservation of farmland and the significant open space through the conservation restriction, so to satisfy Section 8.2.1.5 of our senior housing bylaw, which references cluster development. So the real question is, what is a cluster subdivision, and is it the same as just dense housing? Housing that takes up a small portion of a site that's surrounded by open space.
Well, if this isn't, I don't know what is. I mean, you're building on 16 acres and preserving 44, you know, and 50 units on 16 acres. It certainly meets the intent of this bylaw.
Well, I say doesn't. The origin of this cluster type goes back 20, 25 years. Randall Arendt, who was, did a lot of the conservation subdivision design work, and all planners know it. I'm sure Patrick knows who he is, but he was the one who coined that phrase, cluster housing, and that cluster is a particular word. And maybe the simplest way to imagine is somebody talking about a cluster of grapes on a vine, for example. That vine is not solid grapes on one side and green on the other. It's individual clusters that are spread around. The definition from an APA standard document that I picked out was, cluster subdivision has two characteristics that distinguish it from suburban development of the past decades. The first is a design principle in which small groups of houses are set off from one another by intervening space. The second is the common ownership of the space between the groups. The space is a central feature that is accessible by all residents. So the cluster subdivision has morphed into, it's one of those things that can be abused, but it's been sort of reconfigured by, in some developments, to what it was not really intended to be. The idea was to, if you had 50 units, you would put maybe 6 over here, 4 over there, 5 over on this side, all separated by open space, trees. This is similar to what was done at Magnolia, for example. That is a good example of what was done there.
Where in Magnolia, please?
The Magnolia Grove, is it?
Sure, Magnolia Shores.
Magnolia Shores subdivision over there that Mr. Smith was behind that project as well. But the idea of the clusters is that open space is to become really the design determined. Everything is ordered around the open space. Here we have something quite different. And just to bring in another analogy on this, you can imagine, as an example, you can imagine a donut that has a hole in the center. You can look at the cluster as the donut around a hole, the hole being the open space, so that all the housing could take advantage of the open space. It's in close proximity to all the buildings. Or you could do just the reverse of it. You could put all the houses in the middle, in the hole. In this case, you have 50 houses, and this is sort of the model that they did. 50 units in the middle, surrounded by open space. The thing is that's a much more urban form. It's much more dense, much more tightly composed, and more of an urban form in a rural part of Hamilton. So it just doesn't fit as a model over there. Again, the Magnolia model would have been a better one to use over there, but that's there, and we're talking about this particular project. So I think this is a matter of the choices that were made. I think the cluster was not part of the original intention of what a cluster was supposed to be.
Well, the follow-up question to that, Emil, is the open space meaningful to the people who will be living in this project? I mean, is it even that accessible to them? So we talked about the trails, but I think the only way the residents can access the open space is through the trails because of the slopes.
I don't know if anybody else wants to say something on that.
I would just like to add that generally a cluster development has meaningful open spaces between the units, and in this particular case, the spaces between the units are distinctly unusable. You barely can stand on them because they're all 2-to-1 slopes. It's a series of platforms with houses on them connected by 2-to-1 slopes. So there's really no meaningful open space within the development area is for me the distinguishing characteristic between the true meaning of cluster development and what's being proposed here.
I think we've covered that. So I think we'll turn to landscape buffering, and just to refresh everyone's recollection about the buffering requirements in our bylaw, I will read the provisions of section 8.2.22. And this is regarding, building setbacks shall remain vegetated and undisturbed to the extent possible in order to maintain the existing natural features. The planning board may require designated no-cut zones in order to minimize disturbance and impacts to abutting properties. Buffering from the street and abutting properties in order to minimize visibility is desirable. A landscape buffer shall be provided along the perimeter of the property. For said landscape buffer, natural vegetation shall be supplemented with planting of evergreen trees and shrubs. A landscape plan shall be required. So does the landscape buffering maintain existing natural features and provide buffering along the perimeter of the project?
I'd like to speak about that a little bit. I don't know whether it'd be useful for me to share some images. I can do that. Let me try doing it verbally, and if it seems confusing, I can put some slides up from the applicant's drawings. So along the frontage at Chabaco Road, previously there was 300 linear feet of disturbance. Now it's been reduced to 230 linear feet by taking a couple of the units out of there. So that's a large number of linear feet for just a curb cut. And so that's clear cut, blasted, altered grades, 230 linear feet along Chabaco Road. Then on the southeast slope, at near units 24 through 27, there's another 180 linear feet of disturbance in the 20-foot required buffer area. And then on the east slope, there's another 350 linear feet of disturbance where it's clear cut right to the lot line. So that's a grand total of 760 linear feet of disturbance and clear cutting and scraping of materials from the area that's supposed to be, according to the bylaw, should remain vegetated and undisturbed, and then supplemental vegetation added if required. And it also mentions that the planning board can designate no cut zones. So that's quite a bit of disturbance to that 20-foot buffer. And the most, I think, concerning area is along Chabaco, because Chabaco is a small neighborhood, it's a scenic road, it has particular characteristics that I've talked about in previous meetings. So what's also useful to do, I think, is to look at what's been put back in place of that 230 linear feet of disturbance along Chabaco. So starting on the east side, or the left side, there's 25 to 30 feet of clear cutting and regrading on top of the sheer ledge cut on top of the cliff. And that really hasn't been dealt with the landscape plan. The landscape plan kind of is silent on it and doesn't really show it as being disturbed, but all of the other engineering drawings show it being disturbed and regraded. The specifications show it being replanted with slope mix, and there's no specifications about how they're going to maintain that slope mix, whether that's going to be mowed twice a year like a meadow, like highway embankments are a lot of times done that way. So anyway, it's not reforested, and it's not preserved, and it's not replanted. So that first 20 to 25 feet on top of the sheer ledge is disturbed, and then there's a fence up there, set back from about 20 feet from the edge. So then we come down the vertical blasted face, and that lands in a swale, which is a 4-foot depth and is very, it's right against the blasted face, and it's pretty much right against the sidewalk. So the sidewalk comes right along that swale, and then there's trees sort of squeezed in there. So the trees, once they get to a certain size, those tree canopies are going to be hard against the ledge face. So it's very, very tight in there. Then the next thing is come up out of that swale, and you basically got almost a raised road bed with a sidewalk next to it. And then the grade drops down on the other side into the gravel forebay. There's about a gravel forebay, a little bigger than a 2-car garage, right near the entrance there, and that's never been indicated in the drawings in terms of the representation of the project as it appears. It shows in the engineering plans, but it's never been demonstrated three-dimensionally or in the perspectives. So then, with that topography, what the road is going to look like in that area, and the road's coming down at a 10% slope in that area, right below the cliff. So the road is raised up in the air at least 4 feet on either side, and in some cases greater than that, with the grass slope leading down into the rain garden. So the roadbed is basically almost like a raised, narrow elevated causeway, for lack of a better description. But again, that's never been shown accurately in the drawings. But you can just study the site contours, and that's how it's set up. So then there's a pretty good thicket on a 2-to-1 slope facing out to Chabaco Road that's heavily planted, and that would tend to, when you're standing in front of it, it would tend to block the view of the project, but that's only 70 feet of the 230 feet. So looking up the road, there would be quite a bit to see. I'll get back to that in a second. But even more interesting piece is when you walk to the right, further out toward Essex Avenue, and get past that 2-to-1, that 2-to-1 slope with the nursery stock on it, now you're into the undisturbed tree canopy. And if you if you stand on Chewbacca Road and look up the slope, and maybe if I've mentioned this before, stop me, but basically you can see the edge of disturbance stakes from the road in the summertime with full foliage. So if you can see those stakes, then what you can see up there is the new disturbance, which is characterized by riprap. The riprap starts immediately as soon as they get out around the rain garden there. So from Chewbacca Road, you'd see a ribbon of riprap, and sometimes it's 18 feet tall, and it's a continuous surface so that it's a uniform, whether it's a grass bank or riprap, it's a continuous surface, so you'd see it as a strong form through the trees. So essentially, when you put together all those pieces, plus you can really look up the road and see a lot of those units and the steep slopes around the units, because it's sort of like stadium seating climbing up the slope. Some of the peer reviewers mentioned that when commenting on the perspective. So the question is, with that amount of disturbance and what's being put back, which is certainly not natural topography and certainly not going to screen all those elements, the question is seeing bands of riprap and seeing what sort of amount to highway embankments, in various spots. Is that really in character with Chewbacca Road? And so I'll stop there.
First of all, if you're putting 40 or 50 houses out there, it's got to change the character of the road. It's got to be completely different character.
I might speak for a minute on a concern about any landscaping on the site that is installed. As Emil said last time, the 10 or so acres that are going to be clear-cut, stripped, blasted, are going to have to be essentially rebuilt. And the rebuilding takes the form of on-site stone crushing, which will be anywhere from a couple feet to maybe even 10 or 15 feet of depth. And then some amount of topsoil that was originally stripped, I presume, will be put back on top to provide a foundation for both the houses and for landscaping. Now, a foot of topsoil is fine for a small bush and grass and a bunch of other things, but the notion that we could plant significant large trees or have large trees successfully grow on any area that was clear-cut and then rebuilt with all of this gravel would seem to me to be quite problematic. That you can only grow small, unless the developer is going to put 4 feet of topsoil on top of the gravel. The gravel's used to level things on the solid granite. And so I'm just very, very skeptical about what level of landscaping will in fact survive on this site. Again, I can see grass and small bushes, but it's really hard to imagine any kind of deep-rooted tree ever taking hold on any of the land where the original trees have been cut. So the developer gave us this aerial image of the 9 acres and surrounded by mature trees, and some of those mature trees are going to be new, and I don't see how they're going to survive. I mean, I think maybe Jonathan's description is correct. When we're 10 years from now, when we're on Essex Street, where we're going to look up and see is maybe a few trees, but mostly riprap and then the development itself, because any extensive landscaping is not going to, I just don't think it's going to be able to grow on the rebuilt surface that will constitute the development.
Marnie, just a second. As the landscape technique, when you build in an area that has had some work the way this is being proposed to have is you build what's known as a tree pit. That tree pit has a certain amount of soil that goes underneath the root ball of the tree, typically a foot to 18 inches. It also goes laterally to provide more soil out from the tree ball, probably a foot or 18 inches that direction as well. This provides it with soil, it provides it with nutrients and stability. That's the landscape architectural treatment that you typically need to do in an urban environment or a location where you've had a lot of site prep like this is going to entail, just for informational purposes.
Great, thank you for that. We do have to take note, though, that with the prevalence of drought, not just in this country, but worldwide, coupled with torrential rains, not just in this country, but worldwide, I note that trees that I've planted 2 or 3 years ago are distressed. And with our water ban, it's obviously not appropriate to water trees that are 15 or 20 feet high, but I have a Stewartia that's distressed because of lack of water. So that, I appreciate what you're saying. I think that's probably true, but again, there are other constraints here with respect to maintaining landscapes in circumstances where we have water bans, and I don't know of any provision in a water ban that would apply to a new development that would say it's okay if you water your trees, but someone down the street can't water theirs. So I just throw that out because what we're seeing globally is rather remarkable. So just one more item in this second category, and that is just the practicalities of maintaining this site. And so the question that I have is how much resiliency is built into the development to really allow for inevitable challenges associated with just unanticipated events, such as climate change. I mean, it's so stark in the world today, and then just lapses in maintenance by the homeowners association, not necessarily in year 2 or 3 of the development, but maybe 10 or 12 years down the line. Is there enough resiliency in the plans for this development? And I'd love to hear from more than Jonathan and Emil. I'm sure everyone has an opinion on this. Pat, do you have any thoughts on this? Because you're familiar with construction and whatnot, and so the resiliency is important. I mean, I can't stress that enough because we're seeing such unanticipated events in the world. I mean, 1,000-year flood in Dallas. Who would believe that?
Right. During a drought. I mean, the goal of any engineer would be to design something that's easy to maintain, because then it may be maintained. If it's something over elaborate and expensive and difficult, those are the things that get deferred and over time have issues. I guess I'm trying to pick out any specifics to this project where, that's a general concern of any project for sure. And I always, with this one, go back to realizing the full benefit of the constraints of the site and the issues in maintaining the systems that are being designed, because there are 50 units in a small area that's, difficult to build on. So I keep trying, I'm weighing against, okay, the engineers did probably great a job as they could with the constraints they have on the site for 50 units. And it's the scope of the job to me that's creating the issues, not necessarily, the how they've approached the design and maintaining the site in any of the specific design techniques they use. These are general issues.
Right.
of any construction site, yeah.
I think you hit the nail on the head. I
Yeah.
think that everyone agrees that Granite Engineering did an outstanding job in designing the system for this very difficult site. The question is, what, the choice that was made, was it a wise one? You know, we can't second guess the applicant, but perhaps there could have been alternatives that wouldn't have necessitated such reliance on structural systems as opposed to more natural systems to handle water and erosion and that type of thing.
Right.
Bill, did you have any thoughts on that?
Anytime you have 50 units clustered as close as these, I mean, it essentially operates like a condominium association. When you have a larger development, people tend to take care of their own lawn. They have an incentive to. They take care of their own drainage and sewage. But in a system like this, it's almost like a high rise. Everybody is going to expect the condominium association or whoever the governing body is to do all the work. Because these are public goods. And so to the extent that the condominium association is completely on top of everything and the assessments go through, you know, maybe it will work. But the systems that have been designed are very complex and they're subject to failure if they're not maintained. I mean, the project is very sensitive in that way. And we know what condominium associations can happen, you know, we have Florida. And so it's possible we could design a set of conditions, annual, require the condominium association make an annual fee in lieu of something to the town, which they get back as long as everything is done according to plan. But it's a difficult situation.
But even given what you're saying, it would require an inspector, not quite full-time, but a large number of hours in a month or a couple of weeks to make sure everything's being done. Just to ensure that what was said was needed is getting taken care of. 'Cause some of
Right,
this
I mean,
stuff-
I guess we could write that into a set of conditions, such as Patrick started to create.
Yeah, because some of this stuff,
And
you can't tell if they haven't done it until it's too late. The grass has died, any plants that have been treated, and bushes.
or the drains are
died.
clogged, and you don't know they're clogged until they flow over.
Pardon me?
You don't know the drains are clogged until they flow over.
Yeah.
There's another approach too, to, you know, I know that there's a phase 1 and phase 2, and I know that sometimes there's a condition around timing of one phase over another to evaluate how the site's performing, how it's being maintained, how well it's being constructed and whatnot. I guess if there was a concern on the scale of it and how it's maintained or how the impact of the environment and everything else is happening along the way, there could be a limit to construction of phase 1 and then a time period that would have to go by before being able to then further proceed into phase 2.
But is that going to interfere with the economic necessities of the developer?
Yep.
It would, because the way the units are being constructed, they'll begin phase 2 after 12 units are constructed in phase 1 and 50% of them are sold. So they will finish the units in phase 1 during phase 2 while they're also building the phase 2 units. So the critical path for the construction extends into the second phase.
Yeah, they're basically using the early construction to pay later construction and it gets
Absolutely.
down the road.
So let's move on. I think we've explored that. And of course, we can
I just-
always circle back to anything any issues that you might want to consider more. But I'd like to get through
Okay.
But no, go ahead, Emil. You were
Yeah, I
you were
just,
sliding in
the
there.
issue around resiliency, and you see it in structural engineering, where they used to refer to it as an ignorance factor, unanticipated loads on a beam, for example. So they always did, and you would typically find, they would design it to a design strength and then add something to it, just in the event of some unanticipated thing. And that's part of what, in the resiliency part of it, why that stormwater management says use natural hydrology whenever possible. Ideally as much as 50%, and that's really to take up, so that you don't have full reliance on a structured system for all of your runoff. And again, it goes back to, was this designed well, is to me, and that's the issue. We can condition it, I guess, just say there shall be a certain report. I mean, Mr. Emery said that the town ought to hire somebody to do the monitoring, I think he said in his last report, or it would be well advised, not rely on the condominium association. But it's part of the design part of it. You build in a resiliency so that unanticipated factors that will happen can absorb some of the occasional incidents that do happen. And the problem, and I think as Jonathan pointed out, was such a high maintenance, low resiliency here. Everything is being pushed to the extreme. You have construction right down to a buffer area on 2-to-1 slopes, and what can go wrong there? And so it just on and on. Every single corner you look on this project, it has, it's a stress point on the project, and I think that's what. So it's totally reliant on the homeowners clearing drain inlets from debris or whatever, to be sure that during the course of the life of the project that, everything is just maintained very well from beginning to end. Otherwise, you're going to get flooding across Chavaco. And I mean, this is something, if you really study the drawings, I think you're going to realize what could potentially happen here in some cases that were never brought to light, frankly, during the course of the presentations. But it's the resiliency that's really being pushed to the limits.
I'd like to clarify a couple words that Emil just mentioned. One was design and the other was engineering, and I'd like to separate those words. If you look back at basically all of the bylaws, they separate the process into design decisions, site design decisions, and then in the engineering. They're two steps, they're two different steps, and they're really two different processes, and excellent engineering has nothing to do with the initial design decisions. Those are independent of the engineering. So I just want to make that clear, so that I don't think there's anybody on this board who thinks that the engineering wasn't fully vetted, that there wasn't a full peer review of all the engineering calculations and engineering strategies. That's not really the subject at hand. The resiliency issues are in the design component of it, not the engineering component of it, which is the initial decisions about what's the configuration of these buildings on this hillside, what's disturbed, what isn't disturbed, what slopes are recreated. That's the issue, not the engineering. I just want to clarify that.
Yeah, just as a simple example, if designing a building, I would typically hire, say, a structural engineer, and he comes in and does the structural analysis of the building, and I get a report at the end. He does a beam design, and it checks out. He did everything perfectly. So, but that's not the same as, is the building successful? Does the building function? Does the building meet its purpose? And all of those things. There's a whole series of questions that the engineering is not going to solve, because it's out of their lane, and they're not going to go over there. Rarely they venture into design aspects unless they're asked to. But
our firm does stormwater design very, very frequently, and we start the process with very, very careful environmentally sensitive site design, basically following all the principles we've mentioned around that. And the engineers don't come in till the very end of that process and do the analysis and calculations based on the design strategies that we've set forth. So again, I just want to reiterate that, make sure that's clear.
So,
It's great to have an architect make the clarification. Normally engineers are the one defining those differences. It's good.
so I think all these are interesting topics to discuss. However, this isn't the first project that's ever been done of this scale or size or this type. So all of this is, I understand the concerns, and they're legitimate concerns. But this is not like the first time this has ever been done in a difficult site. And as everybody has said, nobody has a problem with the engineering. They have a concern, what I'm hearing about is the maintenance of these systems to make sure this project operates as designed. Well, that can be built into the conditions so that it is ensured that the maintenance is done and they don't require somebody to be there on a regular basis. It's a minimum of an annual inspection or a semi-annual inspection of the stormwater system and maintenance. So this is not rocket science. So I think while it's a concern and you want to make sure it's dealt with and included in any kind of condition, we need to be careful about making a decision here, because our decision needs to be based on objective criteria. This is speculation that it might not work, but our role is to make sure that we're following the engineering, and if we do have concerns, is make sure it's built into the conditions.
What I'd like to add to that, did you finish, Rick?
I am.
Yes, okay. What I'd like to add to that is the design components are not just germane to the maintenance and resilience. They're also germane to the safety concerns that have been talked about, and also the buffer concerns that have been talked about. Basically, if you look at it, virtually all of the concerns that have been brought up around this project emanate from those initial decisions about not necessarily engaging in environmentally sensitive site design, which is what the bylaws request as a first step. So there's many themes that grow out of that, that heavily leaning on engineering in this proposal rather than environmentally sensitive site design. So it's not just resiliency, it's safety, is it in character with the neighborhood, is it the right thing in the right place?
I'd like to sort of play on this idea, these words, environmentally sensitive site design. I can imagine a project like this at a dozen other locations in Hamilton, where admittedly there isn't any land available, or there's plenty of land available. There's no land for sale. And, you know, the project would fit right in, wouldn't create any concerns such as we have with this site. And instead, what happens is this project is proposed to basically wipe out the natural landscape, to blow it all up, cart it away, crush what's left, and then builds totally anew, on scrap, on top of it. I mean, I can't think of, a type of project that would be more environmentally unsensitive than one that's just, it's like clear cutting a forest, blowing up a hill. It just has absolutely no environmental sensitivity at all. I think the concept of the plan is terrific. I think it's a great use for the town. We need senior housing and so on, but we can't possibly consider this project to be in any way environmentally sensitive to the site. It is just exactly the opposite. It basically takes whatever's there and blows it up, levels it, crushes it, and starts completely from scratch.
So what do? Do we ask the developer to come back with a whole new plan?
that's not our purview. Our purview is, I mean, I think our purview is to say, if our bylaws, are suggesting that environmental sensitivity is an important part of getting a special permit, this project is just not environmentally sensitive. It is in a, as Jonathan says, it is in an engineering sense. They're kind of like bending over backward. Once they've blown everything up and started from scratch, they're trying very hard to make sure that the drainage and everything works. But that's not what the term environmental sensitivity means. It means you're somehow, leaving all the natural resources, as many as possible of the natural resources of the site, and blending the project in. And if this project can't be blended in, then it shouldn't be built.
Well, okay, which means...
Just with respect to that limited objective.
Which means that we would effectively be denying the permit.
Well, I think you're jumping into.
Well, maybe we're jumping ahead a meeting or two, but...
Jumping ahead.
Right, but I mean, this is all theoretical.
No,
part of this discussion.
it's not, I mean, you could not assemble a group of architects or planners or any professionals, show them what's proposed for the site and ask them, is this a plan for this site that is environmentally sensitive? They would all say no, they're going to blow it up and start from scratch. It doesn't have anything to do with the environment, okay?
Okay, I get that.
Okay.
But what I'm doing is going one
That's
step
just
further.
one part of our bylaw. I'm not saying how I'm going to vote or anything. I'm just saying that's a phrase we've used a couple times here, and I just think we don't want to. I don't want to be unclear about this.
Okay.
The project is not environmentally sensitive.
So what do we have as a recourse? What can we do?
Why don't we come to that after we
Yeah.
have all of our other deliberations? This is just regard to this one thing.
We have other factors to consider, so let's move on and we'll
Right, but how okay,
it's all going to
Okay.
come together after we
Okay.
go through this process, and then each of us can assess all the different purposes and the specific findings that we have to make. And under 10.5.2, we're instructed to weigh various considerations. So in many respects, it will be a balancing act.
okay.
So let's move on then. So we want to consider the relationship of this project to the neighborhood and the community. So one of the topics that we need to consider is the compatibility of this development with the adjacent land use as well as neighborhood character. So in our bylaws, there are references to rural New England character. So I ask everyone, how would you describe rural New England character? And also, in this context, what is the neighborhood character? So we start with rural New England character, and
Cows, horses.
no, but there's a...
White clapboard houses.
Right, well, there's vernacular architecture, and you see it, you see forms repeated over and over again, and you often see buildings that have the gable end toward the street. So there is a vernacular architecture, and I think that, and I've mentioned this project before, the boulders, I don't know if any of you have driven through there. Have you, Pat?
Yes. Yeah.
So, to me, that is a development that used rural vernacular New England architecture and integrated it into the site. I mean, you see the front porch, the garages are offset from the open space, which is in the center of the development. So, to me, that's more typical of, that typifies rural New England character. So, does anyone else have any thoughts about what rural New England character is like?
Add to the cows.
Other than horses, and we don't have too many cows.
Cows and horses. and-
Cows, you go to Wyoming, where I just was.
Yeah.
I think a lot of towns struggle with this, what's going on in construction now, and what's happening to communities, in that there seems to be a lot of what would have been referred to as generic housing that goes up. It could fit here in Hamilton, or it could fit in Peoria, Illinois. So it's that kind of architecture that's not meant to offend. That's the goal, and wherever it goes. So it's a type of development that, because it belongs everywhere, it belongs nowhere. And I think that this.
Uh-oh, we're in trouble then.
We're in trouble.
That's a great phrase. I'm going to remember that.
So it's, again, the thing I would see it, I've seen it a lot, in times, in years past, going on. I'm not referring to this particular project, but there are specific characteristics that would define it as a rural, characteristic. And it doesn't mean, just a farm on every property, but,
Well, and this is a tough one because
well,
these, by their very nature, it is distinctly different from the standard Hamilton housing type. Because you look at Patton Ridge or Canterbrook and you go, well, that, it's 4 units an acre or 3 units an acre. That doesn't fit within the standard of any kind of other development in Hamilton. So it's kind of like, okay, you're trying to fit a round peg into a square hole.
I don't think it means you give up either, trying to get something better. I think, I looked at I had a publication by Fred Heyer, who, he had done a book on preserving rural character, and what was interesting about the book is that he would identify different characteristics that would be consistent with what it means to have rural character, and he would develop different scenarios. What is a rural character in say, in this case, single-family development, land form is a wooded lot. So what are some of those characteristics? And I think none of these are going to come as a surprise, but the two major aspects is minimize visual impact of the development. So the structures should not be placed on ridge lines, number one. Trees on ridges should not be removed. Retain woodland features. Stone rows and tree lines should be preserved. Tree areas between the principal structure and the drive or roadway should be retained. And the creation of extensive lawn areas should be discouraged. Now, I think all of us have traveled down Chabaco, and that probably typifies all the houses on Chabaco Road. To me, all of those would be consistent. And yet, I think none of those exist on this particular site, on this development that we're looking at. So can you then say it kind of fits the rural character of Chabaco Road when you have this dramatic change in form, in character, this kind of loose arrangement of houses, different setbacks off the road, trees in the front yard. And again, if you want to build in character on a site, you leave as much of that site as you can, because that's a direct connection to what's there. So I think that's, again, that goes back to site-sensitive design. The more you leave that's there, that establishes a stronger connection to the neighborhood. If you take everything down and start from scratch, you can build anything. And then you've got to be much more careful in what you build if you want to maintain character. And this seems to be a very strong point in all of the regulations. Character is mentioned a number of times in the bylaws, I think. So I don't know, beyond that.
Well, here's the fundamental question then. It's whether this development preserves this rural New England character, and in what ways does it relate to the neighborhood?
What I was going to say is I find that discussing or dictating architectural style, for me, is a slippery slope, and I try to avoid it. However, what's not a slippery slope for me whatsoever is having whatever you design respond to the site. And so to me, if you were to ask me, define how you would achieve rural New England character, it would be respond to your unique site. That's how I would define it, not by an architectural style. And so, again, I've gone through what the characteristics of Chabaco Road are. I don't want to repeat them, but I think that this proposal does not follow any of that lead.
It goes to Marnie's distinction between imposing the development on the site, and what was the other?
Integrating.
Right.
Can I just take a moment and read the, it's just interesting, the definition of low-impact development, it's per the town of Hamilton's stormwater management bylaw, and it's required where applicable per senior bylaw 8.2.13. So it's just interesting, simple concept. A set of strategies that seek to maintain natural systems during the development process. The idea is to create homes and businesses that are integrated into the landscape, not imposed on it. There is rural New England character.
This is almost totally imposed. You're talking about blowing up stuff and cutting down trees, and it's not going to be the same.
So let's turn to variety of building types. That's one of the bylaw provisions that we have to consider. So does this development provide seniors with a variety of building types as well as size, small, medium, and large at a range of price levels?
Just a curiosity, does that come from a section within the bylaw or a bylaw or regulations?
8.2.16.3.
8.2.16. Point 2. Wait a minute. Okay. 3. Got it.
I mean, the developer did make a little, nod in that direction by having, I can't remember, was it half a dozen houses that were a little smaller, 2,000 square feet as opposed to 2,400. I guess I wouldn't mind uniformity of a development that had uniform houses if it was 5 or 10 units, but we're building 50 units here. And that's a lot of units. It's more than all the other senior housing projects we have so far built to date. And if you're going to build that many units, having a little more variety seems to me to be kind of central, as opposed to if you're doing a 5 or 10 unit development.
Well, I was interested in this because I know the applicant's attorney indicated that there were different sizes of units. So I looked at the applicant's Exhibit 6, and I can advise all of you that there are 24 units that have 2,105 square feet, 20 units that have 1,953 square feet, 3 units with 1,778 square feet, and 3 units that have 1,455 square feet. So in my opinion, and it's just an opinion, 44 of the units are roughly 2,000 square feet, and the remainder are modestly smaller, but essentially almost the same size, except for the 3 that are at 1,400 square feet.
I think rather than just focus on square footage, it's also useful to look at price point. And I think because of the cost of development on this site, the price points are going to be all relatively high and relatively similar. So that's a piece to think about. And then another piece to think about is the percentage of the allotment of total senior housing that this is using up, and compare that to what's been developed so far, what's left, and in that big picture, is there variety, and how much room does it leave in the remainder of the allotment for additional variety?
By my calculation, there would be 17 senior housing units that could be built. Patton Ridge has 10, Cantor Brook has 23, I believe, and this would be 50. So that's 83. So 83% of that total senior housing would have a price point, I guess, you know, by the time construction is finished, well in excess of $800,000.
And your point's well taken about the price point has to pay for the cost of development,
Right.
but that's true all over Hamilton. When you're paying $400,000 an acre, the concept of affordable housing in Hamilton is a wonderful idea, and one that I've certainly worked very hard to try and accomplish, but it's driven by density, and the only way you're going to bring down prices is increasing density on a site. And these are not going to be affordable by any stretch of the imagination, but affordability is such a subjective criteria, especially in this town. When a house down on Cutler of 900 square feet on a third of an acre sells for $600,000, you know, it boggles my mind is what housing costs now to develop. We're looking at what, $350, $400 a square foot now to build a house. It's just, that's on top of the price of land. So, you know, when we wrote this, you know, we hoped that it would yield those kinds of benefits, but the economics unfortunately dictate another approach here. Unless you increase density, it's just not going to be economic to do the kinds of different size and types of housing.
I agree with you, Rick, but I think you have to factor into this development that the costs associated with the blasting and the rock removal are probably unique to this site. Certainly, that was not the case with Canterbrook, which I know that's in the GPOD, but that site is flat, and I don't think it had any ledge whatsoever. And I'm not sure about Patton Ridge, but again, I don't think that was a difficult site. So I think that there are enormous costs associated with
Oh, I certainly
here,
agree.
greater than probably any development on the other side of town, even if it was intended
Yeah,
to be
and it's
more luxury housing.
It's interesting to note, even Patton Ridge now, which was a relatively easy site because it was pretty flat, and even Canterbrook, those units now are reselling for over $1 million. And those are like two-bedroom units, and it's just like, I'm going, this is crazy. It's just insane.
It may not last.
Well,
You know, at some point, there might be a,
it's actually the boomers that are sitting on the accumulated wealth that can afford this.
Right.
It's the next generation down that are looking up going, how do we climb this hill?
right? Do you have any insight on that, Bill, because of your expertise as a professor?
Only one, which is housing has never been affordable since the Second World War. People, every generation says the same thing. And they scrimp and scrape and buy a house, and then it appreciates. And then they use the equity for the next one. And I do think that lack of supply is having a particularly strong effect in the last decade as opposed to 20 or 30 years ago when we just built more homes. But I don't think this housing project is going to substantially alleviate the housing shortage as people are thinking of it.
Well, the problem is the houses are going to cost way too much. I mean, that's essentially what we're saying here.
Supply and demand. It's
Pardon?
supply and demand.
Supply and demand.
It's very simple. We used to be building 30,000 houses a year in Massachusetts, and now we're doing like 10,000. You have an expanding population and a decreasing inventory of housing. Prices go up. It's supply and demand.
And this is exactly what generated the governor's initiative for the MBTA community zoning.
Yep. as ham-handed as it was.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, it's something I had heard that the advent of Airbnb, VRBO, those kinds of, where those who have money and are well-off, boomers maybe, buying houses up as economic generators, and they're renting their house out. Apparently, this is a huge problem in some parts of the country, and it's exacerbating the problem in cities and surrounding areas a lot, apparently more than you would think.
Yeah, especially in those areas that are seeing booms for
Yeah.
some other reason.
Yeah.
You know, and all of a sudden, they're renting out all the houses, and the people that are the workforce
Yeah.
can't afford the rents anymore.
Orlando was a city that I read about. It's a shocking story about the people living behind,
Oh, yeah, they're living in tents.
living in tents, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's turn to the fiscal aspects of this project, and they are well worth noting. So there apparently is a $350,000 one-time payment.
Permitting fees.
Pardon me?
Permitting fees.
Yes. And then the applicant estimates $750,000 per year in estimated real estate taxes. And of course, if the price point goes beyond $800,000 per unit, that amount for real estate taxes may increase.
How much per unit in taxes?
It would
Please?
be $750,000 for all 50 units.
Okay, yeah.
And then there's the payment to the Affordable Housing Trust of $2,174,000. And adding to that, there would be no impact on the school system and no costs associated with the road maintenance.
You know, I
So-
think it's important to remember that those fiscal benefits are definitely true and definitely real, but they're true and real for any senior housing project that looks anywhere like this. It's not unique
Oh,
to
yeah.
this site.
Right.
So, you know, you could pick on any number of sites to where we wouldn't have all the issues that we have with this site, and we'd look at the same set of numbers about, you know, oh gee, isn't senior housing a good deal for the town? And I totally agree with that. But that's something it's not dependent on this site.
Well, yes and no. I mean, because it's really about availability. You know, this site is available. The question is, will any other sites be available? And one thing I was hoping the master plan was going to answer, which I don't think it yet has, is what's left to develop. I'm guessing out of the 9,500 acres that it's probably less than 10%. Once you eliminate all the built land, all the protected land, all the land you can't build on, that's land that's already controlled by various nonprofits. So we're never going to build our way out of this for sure, but it's a decreasing amount of land that is actually available for development.
I think that, and Emil, you correct me if I'm wrong, I think that the consensus of the Master Plan Steering Committee is that the only large potential development sites, and there are problems associated with both, are the Gordon Conway Theological Seminary and the Winthrop School. So, and that's about it, in terms of.
Unless you take the great estates, you know, there are
Well-
about 17 great estates, you know, that comprise probably, 500 acres of land.
I suspect
more
a
than
lot-
that, more than that.
I suspect a lot of that land, though, is subject to conservation
It could be,
restrictions.
it could be.
Or it's chapter
don't-
land.
Chapter
I
land.
don't think it's actually in conservancy. I mean, the current owners have no interest in developing it, but you don't,
Yeah.
there is private land in town that sooner or later
Oh, yeah.
is,
I think it's going to be more infill housing, though, rather than, this scale.
we'll just have to wait and see, but I don't,
But anyway, I just,
there's
it's an
potential
interesting,
Well,
it's a much larger issue.
I would just like to add, before we close that, the potential of form-based code being applied to the downtown commercial district has tremendous potential to create housing. That's all I'd just like to add there. You know, Emil could comment on that, but I think that's a reasonable statement.
Right, so then the question really becomes is how should the planning board weigh the short and long-term fiscal benefits against other costs? And that those costs, some could be anticipated, but others perhaps not. And some of those costs might be associated with the construction and the heavy traffic on roads that the town would have to maintain. And also, if the project were to go forward, the town would more likely than not have to employ either consultants or someone with the DPW to actually monitor the compliance of the homeowners association with respect to their obligations to maintain the stormwater management system that would be in place.
I'd just like to start off with just a small detail of information that surprised me when I researched it, which is that even though, for example, the truck route is on numbered roads which are officially state roads, those state roads are maintained by the town of Hamilton, not by the state. In other words, the maintenance costs are Hamilton's, not the state's.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I thought the reason they never paved 1A is because they were waiting for the state to do it.
No, 1A is the exception. So all the other numbered roads,
So Route 22,
yes, is a state road maintained by Hamilton.
and in this case, it's mostly going to be maintained by Beverly, is going to have to, that's where the trucks mostly are going to go, and Wenham. 22 truck route is more in Wenham than Hamilton, and mostly in Beverly.
Yeah, and I think this is a much larger question, and it would have been great to have the Finance Committee or the Capital Committee talking to us before we close the hearings, because if you talk to the Capital Committee, we're skirting on overrides coming in the future, and these are permanent increases to our tax rate. And fortunately or unfortunately, Wenham is getting there faster than we are. But once they hit $25 per thousand, and we're at what, 18, almost 19, then the state steps in. You cannot raise your tax rate above $25 per thousand. DOR steps in and starts a remedial program. So I know it's not it's tangential to this project, but it's something that planning board needs to think about, not only with this project, but future projects and 133S, Gordon Theological Seminary we're in desperate need of revenue. Talk about rebuilding Winthrop School, rebuilding the elementary school, maybe freeing up the Winthrop site, but you're talking $80 or $90 million for a new elementary school at minimum. So there's some big embedded costs coming that we need to be really cognizant of as we make these kinds of decisions.
Anybody want to add to that? I mean, this is where the balancing comes in.
Yeah.
I think we would all agree. So just returning briefly to the obligations of the homeowners association and also potential responsibilities on the part of the town, I ask, well, given the site complexities and the reliance on structured systems, is it an unrealistic burden on the condominium association to maintain the site's operational performance in perpetuity to avoid irreversible environmental damage to the community? I mean, is that realistic? I mean, and certainly when you look at the short term, when the units are new and everyone's just so pleased to live there, that's one thing. But when it's just like you buy a new car, you really take care of it, and after 5 years, if you get a dent, you don't care. So once the condominium units are are older, are the owners going to be as enthused about maintaining these complex systems? Is that unrealistic?
Last meeting, I kind of said my piece on it, so I look to others to say their piece.
Yeah, and Patrick, I have a question. Maybe you can answer that because we already have 2 senior housing projects, and you may be aware of other projects in other communities. Because it's a real question that this board and other boards would have to struggle with is, how do you ensure that the maintenance of the stormwater systems and other systems is actually done?
They provide us with reports annually. Those reports address who lives there, meaning are they 55 and older, what was maintained, how was it maintained, is it meeting the permits that had been issued to that project? So that takes place for both Patton Ridge as well as Canterboro.
And who do those go to?
Those come to the DPW director.
Okay. And so, just I'm curious, have you seen those reports, or how do they?
I have seen them, yes.
Yeah, I'm just sort of wondering, because government is stressed and underfunded, so I'm just concerned, want to make sure it doesn't somehow get buried somewhere, that we can be comfortable knowing that that's actually going to happen.
Sure, those are certainly followed, because if there are drainage issues, at one point or another, it comes to the town, just like at Zero Bridge Street.
Yeah.
Before, during, and after, the town has to be engaged and involved in what happens, how it happens, protecting private property, public property, development property as well. So it's definitely a hands-on process for sure, but consistent with some of the comments I think that have been made before, we can make these reports mandatory to come to this board. We can make them mandatory that they be more involved, more detailed, more demanded in a way that, makes the board comfortable with the outcomes.
Yeah, and I think they would want to go to the Conservation Commission as
Sure.
well. I'm sure they're going to require annual or semi-annual or some kind of reporting.
Yeah, very much so.
Patrick, what happened at 10 Bridge Street?
We have,
What?
That's the land that's being cleared. We talked a great deal about stormwater management there.
Yeah, okay.
Is there ever an oversight committee option for some development like this, where you have like a neighborhood community representative, town representative, a developer representative, and they meet on some annual periodic basis? Also, the community engagement usually is the ones paying most attention and concerned about those particular maintenance elements that are happening in their backyards, in their neighborhood, and things like that. I don't know if that's an option to consider or not.
You know what, as far as setting regulatory demands, relative to maintenance of the project hereafter, this board has the full ability to set those kinds of requirements. I am unaware of that sort of approach here in Hamilton, but I can tell you, as I worked in Hamilton, the company MathWorks did about 150% expansion to their property, which was abutting residential property on 3 sides. We created a review committee to work through all of the concern items. It was largely landscape and landscape maintenance over time that people were most concerned about, but drainage was also part of that as well. So You know, you can build these permits as inclusive as you want and as public as you want
Where was that, Patrick?
in Natick.
Oh, okay.
Well, we have to remember that with every 2.5 inches of rainfall, the rain gardens have to be inspected. So I think in this circumstance, a yearly report might be a little late in the game. So one would have to factor in the necessity of ongoing maintenance here and to make sure that's done somehow, some way. So maybe we should turn to the issue of lighting. The applicant has, in compliance with the planning board rules and regulations and also the bylaws, submitted lighting plans, and I'm wondering if, and that, by the way, is section 8.2.17, and I'm wondering if one has perceived any issues with the lighting plans as they are presented, because obviously the amount of light coming from this site has the potential to negatively impact the abutters, who I believe one gentleman indicated that when the lights, the street lights burned out on Chabaco Road, there was great rejoicing. So the abutters really do cherish their very dark community, and probably the skies are darker there than anywhere else in town. So did anyone see any issues with the lighting plans?
Well, I know they submitted a photometric chart of the ground lighting as based strictly on the street lighting, and that certainly meets the standards of no trespass. There's 0-foot candles at the property lines. That's only one aspect of lighting, though. Glare is another one. What we haven't, actually, the street lights that are being used, they're 16-foot poles, I believe, is what they're using. It's actually one thing I noticed in the rules and procedures, they recommend not being greater than 15. It's a minor thing, but 15 feet would be a better height. It's more residential than 16. That's more like parking light. But I did notice, I checked with the Hubble, the manufacturer of those luminaires, and they're all LED lights, which are pretty bright. But one of the concerns I had was the cutoff on it. And I talked with a representative from the company, and the LED light actually is on the bottom of the luminaire. The luminaire is like a half-round globe on top, and the luminaire is right on the bottom. And I asked him what the cutoff is on that, and he said it's 85, 90 degrees, which, you know, you're looking for a 45 degree at least on that. So what the representative told me was that it's not really a cutoff light as such. The only other issue around
Cutoff light goes down.
Cutoff usually has a shield so that it prevents a light from going out at a particular angle. Usually anything beyond 45 degrees is not a cutoff light. So that's one thing, but I also noticed with a 16-foot lamp and a luminaire up 16 feet, when you go up that access road, you're going to be looking at the underside of every single light pole going there. You can actually see that light, that LED light on the bottom of that luminaire.
That, of course, means that the people who live across the street,
Yeah, they're going to see.
they're going to see into the bottom of the light, too.
Yeah, now, that's, I mean, can't dispute the photometric chart, but that is a light you're actually going to see, and typically, that light that you see is a different light from what's on the ground. So, the other thing is we have really no idea what the individual houses will do for exterior lighting. You know, will people put in, you know, floodlights to light up their whole front lawn, or, you know, out of safety or whatever reason? It's just something we don't know, and that's really not established yet in any way. So that's another potential for glare off the site. But,
So you would put that in as a condition?
yeah, it could be, yeah.
We could put that in.
Well, I'd just like to add that also consideration or thought is that during the wintertime, many of those trees are deciduous trees. So and where the property is clear cut on the top of the hill, and it's quite an elevation up in the air. Again, there won't be lumens bleeding off this, foot candles bleeding off the site, but there will be glare, most likely even from Essex Avenue, because the site is so dense, it's so clear-cut. Once you get up into the property, there's not many, most of the trees are concentrated down at the foot of the slope, near Chabaco for screening, and it gets more sparse up top. So I think you'd be very aware at night of that compound from Essex in the winter. And you'd probably even be aware of it in the summer through the trees, and it wouldn't be as bothersome, but you'd be aware of it because it's up so high, and there's very little tree canopy left when you look at the site sections that were provided by the applicant. And the other thing I haven't mentioned is that when you do clear cut like that, what tends to happen is the trees left at the edge have lost their neighbors, so to speak. So they've lost the nutrients, the root system, all the benefits of a community of trees. So what tends to happen in the first 3 to 6 years after clear cutting is the trees right around the edge of the clear cut show signs of stress. So they might drop leaves, they might thin out, they might even die. That doesn't always happen, but it can happen. If that happens, those edge trees are the most important trees for the screening from Chabaco and Essex, especially as you get further away from the property. The first rows of trees along the edge of disturbance.
Yeah, we're talking about this because of 8.2.17. It's mentioned there.
Any further comments on that? So now we'll turn to mitigating impacts to abutters and the community. And these topics should occupy us for a bit and are really quite critical to this development. So the questions really are, and we can consider each plan separately if you would like. Do the construction management plan, the rock handling plan, and the SWIP protect the environment and mitigate impacts to abutters and the surrounding community? And so with respect to these plans, we have to consider the potential noise pollution, the potential impact of dust, and also presumably the SWIP will be effective in catching any runoff, because the applicant has indicated that, say, the crushing machine will be hosed down to prevent dust, but there'll be water flowing from that as a result. And also the rock handling plan now calls for watering the crushed rock before it would be transferred to any other portion of the site. So the SWIP, we only see a draft of it, and I understand that document is normally not even presented until a contract is executed between the developer and the contractor. But we would have to rely on that SWIP to protect the environment from these kinds of watering situations.
You haven't even mentioned fumes and stuff, odors from the trucks.
Absolutely. And that's
How many trucks a day are they talking about?
The estimate, I believe, was, and I can find the exact figure if you would like, it was, I think, approximately 4,700, but that number would have to be doubled.
Not a day.
Not a day.
No, in total.
Their number was about every 10 minutes.
Every 10 minutes.
Right.
Yeah, so 8 hours would be,
But that was the total number. That was the total number of Bentley Warren 18-wheelers.
Okay, over the period.
Well, yes, over the
Okay.
period. Both Phase 1 and Phase 2. but that was the Bentley Warren 18-wheelers.
Yeah.
I can get you the precise number.
Yeah,
But, of course, there's a lot of other traffic.
yeah, but
and
those 18-wheelers are the big ones.
They're the big
And-
ones.
And they're gonna be throwing off a lot of fumes.
So if Bill's correct, every 10 minutes, it would be 6 trucks an hour?
I think that was in the
So figure
blasting
an
plan.
8-hour day, 48 truck trips a day.
And I think the blasting was such that every blast would create about a truckload. So that would mean you're going to have 30, 40, 50 blasts a day, every 10 or 15
Ooh,
minutes.
no, I don't think so. If I remember, I could be wrong on this. I thought they were talking about 1 or 2 a day.
Oh, the blasts were 1 or 2 blasts per day.
Yeah, yeah,
So a blast would create a lot more
right.
than one truckload
Right,
worth of
right.
debris. Okay.
Yeah.
The total number of trucks for the entire project, these are the 18-wheelers, by the applicant's estimate, 4,324. So I was
4,000 plus truckloads?
those are the 18-wheelers, and you would have to double that number.
Because every truck that goes out comes back.
It's back.
Right.
So in
So
terms of like
Okay,
where
got it.
on the highway, you don't want to think of 4,000 truck
So
passages. You want to think of 8,000 truck passages.
that,
Yeah.
how did they categorize that number?
Pardon me?
How did they categorize that number?
That is the total number of trucks exporting rock from the site.
Okay,
So
so that assuming
one
that's a
way.
one-way trip.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the
Okay.
one-way trip, so
Okay.
you would have
Got
to
it.
double that.
Got it.
And of course,
That's a lot of
Ransom
fumes.
Engineering did question those calculations.
Yeah, but I think they weren't differing that much. It was more like 3,500 or 4,000. But that was the same, I think they were in the same ballpark,
Well, I
actually.
think, my recollection is Ransom estimated 10,000, and it really, I think the difference in the calculations, and I know John Durkin did revise.
I think Ransom was referring to one-way trips, and the 4,000 was to, round trips. There were going to be 4,000 round trips.
Oh, no, there are going to be 8,648 round trips by John Durkin's
A round trip is
estimate.
both ways.
Ways.
4,000 one-way trips, 8,000.
8,000, and I think Ransom was saying it would be more likely 10,000, and I think the discrepancy had to do with the weight of the truck itself and what the total weight.
They were arguing over the size of the rocks and how much space would be between the rocks.
Right.
Well,
I think rather than debating
We'll
the numbers,
accept their number.
Yeah,
We
right.
accept
accept their number. So rather than debating those things, I think what's useful to look at is to kind of ask ourselves again the same question: is this a high maintenance, low resilience construction process? In other words, is there any forgiveness in the construction process, from the staging to the to weather to all the different components that go into it, from washing rock to managing sound to managing the traffic? If everything goes right, that's one thing, but again, I live in the world of construction, and the thing that I counsel people on is the thing you have least control over is time and construction sequence. It's complicated and unpredictable. I even characterize it as it's kind of a pre-industrial revolution process. It's a non-factory controlled, non-standardized process that involves many different unrelated businesses and individuals. So you just have to be flexible in how it unfolds. And the question here is there enough sort of forgiveness and resilience in the process for it to be reasonable for the neighborhood?
Well, in this regard, I think everyone, including the applicant's counsel, at one point or another got seriously confused about Phase 1 and Phase 2, and Phase A and Phase B within Phase 1. So my understanding is, best case scenario, this project its duration is 4 years. Within that 4 years, there's going to be an incredible amount of truck traffic because there will be truck traffic for the construction of the septic system. And of course, there'll be truck traffic related to the road construction and paving, as well as the building. And the list goes on and on. We don't have a handle on the number of workers that will actually be involved. The applicant has indicated that no trucks will queue on Chabaco Road, but it's conceivable that there'll be 30 or 40 vehicles on Chabaco Road used by the construction workers who are involved on the site. So that's one
Well,
consideration.
that's a whole different problem, though. What we're sort of asking about first was, how many truckloads can we expect to go back and forth carrying loads away from the project?
Well,
And
for
that's a whole question in it.
the
rest of the stuff is all
I'll give you the answer for the rock going to Bentley Warren. And that number is, the applicant's number is 8,648.
So 8,700 truckloads, roughly.
Well, there'll be a
Round
truckload
trips.
out and then an empty truck
Truck
coming
trips.
back.
That's right.
Truck
So is it
trips.
now then going to be 17,000, or is 8,000 is?
You're just, now we're throwing numbers around like crazy, so
No,
let's
for
stick,
the rocks, it's 8,648.
right.
That is to carry out the unprocessed ledge, which also you have to ask yourself, that the estimate for the amount of ledge being removed, I mean, that is a real estimate.
Right, I
Could it be
understand.
more or
But is
less?
that 8,000 going in one direction or
No, it's
8,000 total?
round
going
trip.
back?
Round trip.
Okay, that's fine.
Round trip.
Okay,
So, but that's just one part of the
Right.
truck traffic
but
relative to this.
that'll be the big part of it.
Well, it will be a large part because those are the huge 18-wheelers.
Yeah.
Those are the trucks that have the potential, the most potential, and I'm not saying they will, but they have the most potential to damage the road.
Yeah,
And these are the trucks that the town of Ipswich said, no, thank you, we don't want these trucks going over the Choke
I don't blame
Bridge
'em.
in downtown Ipswich. Yeah, so, but my point is, we have really no clear understanding of how much other truck traffic will be involved. I read that there would be likely 400 truck trips to build the septic system, but I would have to, search my notes to corroborate that, but I do recall that. So I think that the amount of traffic on Chabaco Road and Essex Street and also Woodbury is a real impact to the abutters. It's undeniable.
I
mean,
understand
It's
that.
undeniable.
Yeah, and I understand that the construction part of it is the bulk of the traffic. The workers that come and go, that's minimal.
Well, if they're 40, the workers are not going to be able to park on the site. I mean, especially at the beginning, because in Phase A, the first thing that happens is they have to get a police detail and start clear cutting to actually get in and build the temporary road. But the workers are not going to be able to park on the site, especially initially, because that's where the temporary road is going to go, that's where the muck pile is going to go, and there's not going
Okay,
to be room
but-
for all those
Right,
people to.
but my point is, their truck traffic is minimal compared to the gross amount of truck traffic from transporting the material out and bringing those transport trucks back in.
Yeah, I'd say that's true,
Yeah,
because
Yeah.
those will be the largest.
They'll be the largest, that
Yeah,
they'll have the
right.
most impact.
The other-
But there's going to be a lot of traffic over the
well,
course
yeah,
of that 4 years.
we know that.
Yeah.
If it's
Anyone
400
else want to
400
talk
workers,
about
it's a lot,
traffic?
400 cars.
I wouldn't mention this, except that Maine Drilling and Blasting brought it up at a hearing, so they pointed with some pride to the fact that they had a project in Woburn 2 or 3 years ago, where they were removing a similar amount of ledge from actually, it was a huge hill just right next to downtown Woburn.
1420 Main Street, I looked it up.
Yeah, I looked it up.
40B.
Did you see, there's some excellent news coverage about, what that's done to downtown and how people feel about it, and I mean, it's not really comparable to this site, but Maine Drilling and Blasting brought it up and said, we can do this. And if you look at the site and watch some of the pictures and the YouTubes, you'll say, yeah, but at what cost? It's quite disruptive.
Yeah, I think the issue is, I think, what are they proposing, I guess, to mitigate the noise and the dust and, other pollutants on the site? I guess I'm with Jonathan. We're never going to find it. We're never going to get an answer to the number of trucks it's going to be. But we do know it's going to be an awful lot of trucks in every aspect of the project, right through when they do the final painting on the buildings. There's going to be traffic going and coming off the hill with people. That's part of normal construction. But again, I think the issue in this neighborhood is the impact on this particular neighborhood. All understanding that construction requires traffic, but there's also a safety issue, I guess, with these tobacco roads. How safe are the conditions going to be? And I'm still not clear, actually, on the construction management plan, the way they're going to handle even the hill, what's going to happen in between Phase 1 and Phase 2 to the existing site up there. I don't think a lot of those answers really came forward because I think they frankly don't know themselves. And I think what's going to happen is they're going to find out how many trucks are going to happen. I think they can probably guess. Certainly the rock they can guess. Because they have a quantity there. But I think the impacts on the neighborhood have to be borne by the people who live there. But noise is one issue, and I wonder if anybody has any idea how they're going to mitigate noise on that hill. I think Jill Mann referred to erecting a barrier there, or she's...
Emil, I actually looked into this because I
Did you?
know on July 26th, this was an issue for the abutters. And the presentation about these mitigation measures took place on April 21st, I believe.
Mhm.
And of course, we're hampered by the absence of minutes. But so here's what I gleaned from watching the YouTube video. The applicant stated that it will place the rock crusher at the lowest point of the development portion of the property. And when I looked at the construction management plan, and anybody who's more adept at reading these plans can correct me if I'm wrong, the rock crusher, while it was lower than some portions of the site, was actually higher than others. So I'm not sure to what extent placing the rock crusher where it was will actually serve any significant purpose. I have no idea. And John Durkin admitted that he was not an expert in noise. And there was a reference to building berms, but those were statements by the applicant's attorney. So we have no idea where those berms would be placed and how they would work. And so with respect to the rock hammer, there is a dampening enclosure over the rock hammer. But there was the rock crusher, noise from the rock crusher was not addressed at all. And so there are regulations governing the amount of noise that can emanate from a site, and that is
Is
Yeah,
that
it's-
from our bylaw?
It's 10 decibels.
And CMR
I
somewhere.
think it's 10 decibels above the ambient noise in the
Yeah.
street. But
right,
something like that. I think.
something like that, but,
How many feet?
well, it's at the property line and at the nearest house.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's 310 CMR 7.10. And so to perform these assessments requires expertise. And so what the applicant stated is that it would comply with all regulations. And so then the question becomes, are you comfortable with that representation? Does that representation alleviate any concerns you may have about the effect of noise from the construction, all aspects of the construction?
Is that an enforceable regulation?
Yes, it is.
All right, so that's a condition you would place, is that you have to meet the,
Well, actually, I think that you can, make that an enforceable condition, but is it even a condition that can be satisfied? That's the question I have. Can they even satisfy,
well,
can they even meet this regulation?
well, that would be, if they can't, then they have to shut the project down and figure out how to do it.
But I think we all know, I mean, I can hear the train.
But,
From my
the
house, I-
problem is that's the worst of all worlds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you strip clear part of the hill and you do something else, and then you find you're in violation of a noise ordinance, and the project sits for 6 months, and nothing's done on it, and then because it's technically impossible to do. 10 decibels is not a lot of noise. And then you have a half-completed project.
Yeah, the noise, ambient noise level on a street level is somewhere between 55 and 60, typically on a quiet street.
Versus a busy street.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
these, I was curious about the crusher, and they operate on 90 to 100 decibels. Now, decibels are not linear, it's a logarithmic relationship.
Right.
So, every increase in 10 decibels is 100
Is 100.
times
Right.
louder. So 100 decibels is pretty loud noise. And then actually I noticed some of these trucks, these 18-wheeler trucks, they're up around 85 to 90 decibels each coming in and out. So when those are operating on the site, those are going to be right on the highway. So I'm not sure how they can get anywhere near the standard of
10.
So does that
What I-
Increase over ambient noise.
What I'd also like to add is those are two very narrow, good topics, trucks and rock crushing, but there's many other
Yeah.
sources of noise. One of the most irritating sources of noise that people kind of forget about is when you're doing blasting, you have to scoop the rock up out of the muck pile and the tailings and whatnot, and the sound of hardened bucket teeth scraping over granite is 1,000 times worse than fingers on chalkboard, and it travels a long distance. Chippers have an incredible long sort of distance to their noise disruption, and it goes on and on with all the different chainsaws. Yeah.
Trucks back up.
Yeah, so all of those things, when they're put on top of a hill, even if you have berms and strategies and whatnot, it will carry. The more they clear out, the more it'll carry. Sound does drop, but it's got quite an opportunity to run a long distance before it drops. But sound does tend to drop over distance.
So
Drop meaning it falls down.
does that mean that it's impossible to enforce the sound regulations?
It's a good question.
That's it? No, that's it.
Well, my question is whether they can actually meet, I'm sorry, my question is whether they could actually meet the regulation in the
That's
first
the
place.
question. Can they
Yeah.
enforce it? Can it be
Well,
enforced?
and if they were to exceed the decibel levels, it can be enforced, but as Bill pointed out, you'd shut the project down. But,
So
I hate to use a pun, but it's between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not gonna find out how bad the noise is until they start.
Okay.
But once it starts, if they can't
But the
meet the regulation.
developer at this point has got to have a pretty good idea of how noisy it's going to be, and he's got to have an idea of what the regulations are, and he's got to know whether he can or can't meet them.
Well,
And my guess is he's not gonna be able to meet them because you drop a rock in a wheelbarrow, it makes noise. And they're dropping lots of rocks in lots of wheelbarrows.
There's
I
an
mean, that's a
acoustical,
problem.
there's an acoustical study they could do where they monitor the ambient for a period of a week. And then they simulate the noise of the activities that are known that are gonna be going on site. And that's done quite often in developments where there's this regulation. And an acoustical study does get done. There's acoustical engineers and analysis that gets done, and it's academic. It's not reality, but it gives you a sense of where you're at with the whole program, isn't it?
Yeah, I think part of this is just to get a sense of the scale of, and I said this last week, but the scale of the project and what's going to happen there. I know they have to deal with it. I just think we ought to be mindful of what could potentially happen that they have to deal with, that's all.
Right.
We're not going to solve that problem, but
So do we just ignore it? Do we just?
No, this is all part of the consideration.
it's consideration, yeah, right.
So how does it play into the consideration? I mean,
This is a cumulative fact-finding process.
right?
Marty's systematically going through elements of the bylaw and asking the board to comment and discuss. So it's a cumulative decision.
Right,
Talk about,
I
it's like
understand.
building pieces of a puzzle.
Right.
In the findings that we have to make, Richard, in section 8.2.31, one of the factors that we have to consider is whether there's mitigation of impacts on abutters.
Okay, but we know there's going to be a lot of noise. Ultimately, how do you deal with that? Are you going to accept it? Do we accept it, or can they realistically mitigate it? I mean, an explosion from dynamite makes a certain amount of noise.
Well, we don't know, but basically, as I said before, when we finally go to vote on the different findings, each of us will have to make our own independent determination as to whether the applicant has satisfied the findings or whether it has not. So we will then go through each one, and that will determine the outcome of our vote. So if you were to look at 8.2.31.7, and Rick may have a copy of that.
Say that number again, please?
8.2.31.
0.7,
Well, excuse me, it's 1 through 7. We have to make findings as to
1 to 7,
1
okay.
to 7. And while you're at it, you could look at 10.5.2.
Okay.
So, we've really discussed this, the construction management plan, and not so much the rock handling plan, but I think it comes down to, several questions that we have to ask ourselves. And one is whether the duration of the project, which by my calculation is approximately 4 years, whether that is realistic, given all that we know about the schedule, and I think we can take notice of all the supply chain issues and whatnot, but whether or not that the construction management plan is realistic. And when I looked at the construction management plan, I did note that when it came to drilling and the paving of the road, there were time elements built in for weather, but no other aspect of the construction management plan had any wiggle room for bad weather. And of course, I'm sure we would all recognize that in construction, probably you wouldn't be roofing houses in the middle of winter. The weather could be a real factor, particularly if it was bitterly cold. So that's a question, and that was something that Ransom Engineering focused on. But I think that for our purposes, we should accept what's given, but with some level of skepticism, because that's quite an ambitious schedule to do all the work on that site. And then the effects on the neighborhood are something that, Rick, to your point, of course it's subjective, but it's also something that we as humans can relate to. I mean, it's going to be quite, the duration and scale of this project is such that the abutters will be affected. How seriously they're affected will depend on whether we accept the applicant's statements as to its mitigation efforts and give them full credence. And again, you know, that's probably not a real science. And so when assessing the positives and negatives of the project, then the question is, how much weight do you give the competing elements, such as the fiscal impacts, the benefits of the annual tax revenues, the project duration, the impacts on the abutters from traffic, noise, and dust, as well as the effect on the natural environment? I mean, how do you balance all that? That's the question. And perhaps we should save the answer to when we go to our findings, unless anyone has some strong feelings on that. And I guess another question is, if the development were to be completed, you know, you have to ask yourself, what will it look like compared to what it is now, and how it would affect the neighborhood and the community at large. Does anyone have anything to add about the SWIP? You're an expert on the SWIP. The rock handling plan, I know that there were some questions about that. Or also the construction management plans. Does anybody have any further comments?
I guess I've seen a site establishment plan, like a site works plan. I don't know if there was an elaborate construction logistics plan that went through all elements of, certainly the rock removal and this, you know, all the earthwork and everything else, but I guess I just don't maybe recall seeing what I would consider to be a complete construction logistics plan that takes in consideration the whole scope of the job.
Well, the construction management plan that I saw was just a series of maps.
Right,
There's
and
no-
basically they said, when and if it's permitted, that's when they put the construction management plan together, because then they know all the conditions that have been placed on a project or not.
I mean, I have the construction management plans here,
Yep, no, I remember that discussion, and there was there was a lot of discussion about it not being complete, and pushback that was typically done after a project was permitted.
For instance,
the
they probably
SWIP
have
is done when the project is completed, but the construction plan that you're referring to could have been completed, I believe.
Sure, right. They probably have a guesstimate of how many people, how much parking they would need to establish, how much lumber they would need to have for laydown areas and
Oh, there was,
construction materials.
we
and things
never
like
saw anything like
that. Yeah, and that's just a point to make as far as you made reference to a
that.
construction plan that I thought was not complete. Start to finish.
Marnie, you mentioned the 10 decibel town ordinance. Will you give us the, reference on that?
It's 310 CMR 7.10.
read that again more slowly?
Sorry, 310 CMR 7.10.
Code of Mass Regulations.
Yep.
And that's a limit on added ambient noise level from construction?
Yeah,
Right.
at certain distances.
Okay.
Well, a change of 10 decibels
A change
at the
at
street
10 decimal places.
due to construction.
Just to give people some relative understanding, sometimes I hate Google. But, here's what it says about vacuum sweeper decibels. Generally speaking, a vacuum cleaner will be around 80 decibels, which is the equivalent of a toilet being flushed.
Yeah, this room with nobody talking would be 35.
Yeah, but this is an additional, I don't know what.
Yeah.
I mean, in theory, you'd go out there with a noise meter and say, during the daytime, the noise on Route 22 is this, and now we can't exceed this plus 10.
That's right.
Right.
It's location specific. I mean,
Right,
it says, you know, to the nearest, I think Marnie said nearest house.
But that's a state regulation.
Yep,
Yes.
Code of Mass Regulations.
Vermont Code of Massachusetts Regulations. And I printed out some information, and to tell you the truth, I had difficulty understanding the graphs and all the associated information about measuring these acoustics. It defied my liberal arts education.
Why do you ask, in consideration weighing the impacts of the project against the economic advantage for the town and the potential benefit for the town? And I'm not, I guess I wonder, do we all have enough information to understand what is the like where is the town financially, and what is the benefit and impact? You know, we get the report card at the end of the year and everything else, we understand how much. I guess I don't know if I personally could understand and assess completely the financial benefit to the town and how much. it would
Well,
provide.
750, what's the town budget? 20 million?
Yeah, it's close to 30.
700 and,
Most of that, I used to know this number, but I think it's 80% of the schools. is the
yeah,
school system.
750,000, let's just say it was free money, $750,000. There was no cost of services. We won't get into that, even though there might be some. So that would be
So,
lowering the tax rate by 1/40th. So about not 2 percentage points, but 2%. So it would lower it from,
Well, you're really not lowering it, you're mitigating.
allowing that much extra
Right, you're-
expenditure. That's
Right,
right.
you're
Keeping it the
mitigating
same,
future. Right, you're giving-
increasing the budget by 2%.
You're mitigating.
Look at it though, I think.
What?
It's an interesting way for the general citizen to look at it though, whenever assessing a financial impact is the.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I said it would have been great to have like John Prulidge or the chair of the FinCom earlier in this discussion, but unfortunately, we can't take any more testimony, I believe.
Right.
So we're kind of stuck with that issue.
Yeah, but it's a good, I think a good point to make. Go back to, like my personal, I don't have enough information, I'll go find the information, and that's a good point to make in the overall assessment of it all.
Well, we haven't, by any stretch of the imagination, concluded our deliberations, obviously, but in terms of the relationships that I initially outlined, we have now completed them. At this point, I thought it would be useful to talk, and I forget who said this, it was so general, wasn't it? The known unknowns and the unknown unknowns?
The known
Maybe we
unknown?
should save that for the next meeting.
The known knowns?
Well, actually,
Where do you want
I thought if any of you had some questions, some known unknowns or some unknown unknowns, now would be the time to maybe make a list of them so that we have them in the back of our mind for our next meeting.
So we don't have to worry about the known knowns?
We don't have, the known knowns are what we have. So I don't know if any of you have any particular questions or just information holes that
What
we
we-
should think about
What would we,
down the...
what would we do with that? Is that to discuss and bring up internally, obviously?
Well, that would go to the findings. So if there's some bit of information that's needed to make a finding.
With the
if we
meeting-
don't have
Well,
that,
well, it
it
would,
might be interesting if anybody
Could we
sees.
bring in new information? If we had an unknown, can we,
no, we
No.
can't.
I'm not sure we can bring in new
All
information
new
on it.
No, the
information.
only way that would work is if you brought up, you have a known, unknown, and say, listen, does somebody else have that? Was that provided
Yeah.
in the
Right.
testimony?
Yeah.
Or
We
documentation?
couldn't go outside and seek more information on it, right?
Right.
Are you satisfied with all the information you've seen, or you just have any outstanding questions?
Well, here's an example. We never had a hydrogeological study, and that is really a point of contention between the applicant and Save Tobacco Trails and Watershed. And our peer reviewer and Rick Frappa, they both indicated that, oh, this would be a waste of time, it's completely unnecessary, you would only do this if it was a Superfund site, and that because of the fissures in the granite, there would be de minimis runoff, and there would never be any impact on Beck Pond under any circumstances. That being said, there was disagreement as to that. And everyone here can make their own assessment about that. My particular question about the hydrogeological study was that it was mentioned at the pre-application conference, and I asked Elizabeth Ransom, how much would it cost and how long would it take? And it would cost $150,000, and it would have taken less than 9 months. And I thought to myself, that's short money to get one big headache out of the way. You know, it would have answered the questions and put any issues as to impacts on the water resources, it would take it off the table. And it occurred to me that the efforts to denigrate the need for a hydrogeological study probably cost more than the hydrogeological study. But that's the only way I look at it, is there an inference to be drawn from the absence of one? And so that, in a sense, is one of my unknowns. That doesn't mean that I do not accept the peer reviewers'
Assertions.
view that the potential risk is very, very small. So, but others
Well, that could be
might have
that could be a
different.
very long list of all the unknowns.
Well, of course. Well, that's,
Wait a minute, though, if you,
but that was a big issue.
No, I'm just, just saying that this could get a little bit,
Well, I mean, that's something that
no, it's a good
is
example.
very important
I get it.
to,
No, I get it.
to people in the community.
if you're gonna do if you did the the hydro study, it would take 9 months to do it, right? And would that mean that construction couldn't begin until that 9-month period had ended?
Oh, I
And-
think that ship sailed. I
Huh?
mean, that ship sailed. I mean, the hydrogeological study could have been done at the inception of this project. I mean, that's the point. I mean, it's been on the table since the pre-application conference. There's not going to be a hydrogeological
Okay.
study now.
Because,
Well, both Jamie Emery and Rick Frappa said it was unnecessary.
yeah,
So the question is, their representations, and they are experts in this field, there's absolutely no doubt, was that the risk of harm to the aquifer and to Beck Pond was de minimis. And so, do you accept that, knowing that there was a possibility of getting a better answer, more certainty even than that? And again, I think everyone has to
Yeah.
answer that question for themselves.
okay. Because I was wondering, thinking, if you did that plan, you now got to put up the start date for 9 months. Does the developer want to go along with that kind of a program?
Right.
They
Well,
don't. They
No,
don't.
of course
That's-
not.
That's
I
why.
wouldn't
they-
want-
that's-
I'd just
that's
walk
why-
away.
That's why it didn't happen.
Yeah,
So that ship, as she said, is,
Unless you started at the top.
the ship has
No,
sailed.
but it is an unknown. It's a, I mean, the other unknown to me, I guess, would be this idea of test wells to check for, changes in the groundwater, contamination, or whatever.
Well, they've already agreed to those.
And that's an unknown. They're perfectly happy to create these wells. And, the engineers sort of think that there's not going to be any change to groundwater in the wells from the blasting, from contaminants. We don't know. You could also have enough blasting to, release other minerals or other things that are buried in the soil that are not part of the aquifer normally, but, you jiggle things around enough, so all of a sudden the wells don't work. And then you're left with, what do we do about it? It's the same issue of,
Well, that's why the wells are there, to actually determine that.
right, but if there's some change to the groundwater,
That's why the wells are there to determine that.
but then what happens?
Then, as I remember from the testimony, is they immediately shut it down and try and figure out what's going on.
Right, but then we're back in this position that we were with the other issue, between a rock and a hard place, which is we have a half-done
Yeah,
project which is causing all sorts of problems and,
Yeah, but no project is without risk, so the whole
well,
point.
but there's another unknown.
the wells are short-term, not long-term, and I think that was the issue with Ransom, I think.
No, they were going to do them before construction and then a year after.
Correct,
Right,
but not 10 years, or
right.
Right, so the major category of unknowns there is generally the peer reviewers focused on the construction process, but they didn't really look at the long-term life cycles of the property as it would be in normal use and normal maintenance. And that was part of the impetus of doing the hydrogeological study, and also in terms of not having the wells just monitored year after, but, I think ongoing,
Then you can
or
make
for 10 years.
That can be another condition.
I was looking at the rules and regulations, the senior housing bylaw again, that Marnie brought up, and item number 2, it says, analysis of environmental impacts, : the applicant shall submit an analysis of existing and expected post-development environmental conditions, including but not limited to the use of best practices proposed to prevent pollution of surface and groundwater, erosion of soil, excessive runoff of precipitation, excessive raising or lowering of the water table, or flooding of other properties, measures to protect air quality, conserve water, minimize noise levels, prevent harmful or noxious emissions, and damage or threat to wetlands and floodplain and the visual environment. There's a lot in that sentence. So my question is, it sounds to me like this is a authorization for a hydrogeological study, in that they're looking for ground. I'm not saying we go back at this stage. I'm just, or if not, what does that really mean then? I don't know if you can.
The other half of that sentence that is off that subject, but is an important part of that sentence, is it talks about, and the visual environment. And this board, a number of times, asked that project be presented accurately in 3 dimensions. And what we've heard, and you've heard quite a bit from me, is that it hasn't been presented clearly or accurately as far as its 3-dimensional impact, both visually and behaviorally, on the project, even though that was requested. So the hydrogeologic study was requested, refused. The accurate description of this project in 3D form was asked and not delivered. And that ties right to this
So, in the interest of
regulation.
in the interest of time, since we're getting late, and I'm wondering if we want to make a list of each individual member has those, whatever we're calling them, concerns, unknown concerns, or concerns of unknown information.
Well, I have the hydrogeological study and the 3D,
An accurate 3D description of this project as designed, beyond abstract contour lines, riprap, and site plans.
The 3D description would be perfect time to check on light pollution.
Well, yeah.
That's
I mean,
harder.
that would be,
That's harder.
that's
hard.
different.
You
That's
can't do- Are
different.
you gonna,
Well,
Have to build a
I gave you,
physical
I gave you,
model
I gave you another
virtual
example of an unknown. We don't know if or whether there will be long-term damage to the trees at the edge of the disturbed area, and that would affect light pollution. And that can happen, or it might not happen. But there's a chance of it happening.
Again, I'll submit that there may be others that people have not thought of yet that
Well,
we
there's
might want to.
nothing to prevent
No, no, I'm
anyone
just
from
saying-
bringing it up subsequently.
I'm just saying for organizational purposes, it might be helpful for people if they have them, that they could submit them to Patrick, they could go to you, so you have a list compiled, so rather than us some sort of fumbling around going, does anybody have an idea? And we're all going, can we come up with it now? Are there others that as we ruminate on this, that we want to discuss?
Oh, right, and I think the noise, because you said that there was potential to do some type of noise analysis, that wasn't done. So we really have a big hole in our understanding of how noise is going to emanate from the site. What did you call that noise study?
Acoustical.
Yeah, acoustical analysis.
Acoustical analysis.
So another tidbit I'd just like to point out, in the same document that Emil was reading from, which is the Senior Housing Bylaw Rules and Regulations, there's a section that says, a senior housing design plan shall be designed to conserve water for domestic consumption and for lawn and landscaping maintenance. So I gather what that means is, rather than directing the roof runoff into a rain garden, it's capturing it somehow for irrigation. I don't know what, that's just a question.
And where you're gonna put the irrigation or anything else.
a large part of the West has rules and regulations about that, capturing rainwater, putting it in cisterns right next to the house, using it temporarily storage, and then using it to water lawns. That's a very common design practice. I don't know how expensive it is, but
Well, I'll tell you, in Wyoming, just as an aside, and I apologize to all the participants, but when you buy property in parts of Arizona, of Wyoming, the property comes with water rights, and it comes with grazing rights on Bureau of Land Management land. So when you buy property, it behooves you to get a lawyer from Wyoming to make sure that you have water. And you have water rights, because otherwise you're in real trouble.
I'd like to read one other thing from that same document, and it differentiates between shall and should. So it's under item 5, Senior Housing Design Plan Standards. So a senior housing design plan will be reviewed for consistency with the following development standards. A standard expressed as shall is a requirement for any senior housing development unless the applicant demonstrates to the satisfaction of the planning board that strict compliance would render the development unfeasible. So that's a pretty strong statement. A standard expressed as should indicates that a local priority that the applicant is expected to meet through all commercially reasonable efforts. So that's the differentiation between should and shall.
Now, shall is a legal term, means you must.
I'm just reading from the
I'm just
rules
telling
and
you what-
regulations.
I'm just giving you a definition. Shall in legal means you must.
Right. And what Emil read was the analysis of environmental impacts. That was a shall, and the capturing rainwater for irrigation was a shall.
Was a what?
Shall. Senior housing design plan shall be designed to conserve water. Just to clarify the difference between the terminology.
All right, why don't we, given the time, why don't we turn to the list that I prepared of the bylaws that I don't believe are either applicable one way or the other, or outcome determinative because they're not in dispute. And if we can agree that these provisions that I outlined are in fact ones that do not need to concern us in our deliberations, we can make note of that, and then when the decision is written, it will simplify matters because these particular provisions won't be ones that have to be addressed except in a very brief way. So I assume everyone has their senior housing bylaw in front of them. Does everyone have theirs?
I don't have it.
No, I don't. Did these come from the checklist that was done last winter?
Actually, I think it came from just me going through the
Oh, okay.
bylaws and going,
Are you thinking of going through section by section?
well, if you just look and see if you agree with me that we don't have to concern ourselves, and if you don't agree,
No, I'm just wondering, are you starting at the beginning and going from 8.2.1 and right
oh
through?
yeah, I just went through them sequentially. So 8.2.2, eligible locations, not an issue.
Yeah,
Administration, not an issue.
yeah.
Planning board rules and regulations, they are what they are. Age restriction, not an issue.
Yeah,
Limitations on the development, not an issue.
yeah.
Permitted uses, not an issue.
Hold on. Gotta get the page. Okay.
Developable acres, I don't believe that's an issue.
Nope,
The base senior housing density,
not an issue.
not an issue. I lost one.
General compliance, 8.2.12. I think that's the next.
8.2.11.
Yes.
8.2.10, that wasn't an issue. I could have added 8.2.10. I missed that one.
Yeah. No, I mean, that whole section is
Yeah,
gone.
not applicable. 8.2.11, where did that go? Oh, right, minimum distance between properties, not an issue. 8.2.14, exemptions, not an issue.
Yeah. Dimensional standards, not an issue.
I would disagree with that, because that's the vegetated buffer. That was the presentation I gave this evening. So
Which one was that?
that's 8.2.15, table of dimension standards, which ties into,
I don't think she mentioned that one, though. I thought it was 8.2.14.
I think Rick just mentioned 8.2.15, rather.
I didn't include that one.
Oh, you didn't? Okay,
No.
but Rick just said it's satisfied. That's all. I'm
You
commenting.
disagree, so we won't put.
I disagree, yes.
Okay.
But do you want the reason I disagree, or
No,
just
not now.
accept it?
We're going through this to.
Perfect.
Let's finish going through it.
Perfect.
So we agree on 8.2.14 now?
Yep.
And then I skip to 8.2.21.
Yeah.
That is parking, not an issue.
What about signs?
You know what?
We don't have a sign right now.
Don't have a sign.
It's a gap.
Add that to the unknowns.
Okay.
We had a sign and we rejected it, and it hasn't been, a new one hasn't been presented.
And site access and road design and management?
I'm on 8.2.21 was parking, that's okay.
Yeah, what about, I'm just going through this sequentially to check off whether we have questions or it's done. So 8.2.19, site access, roadway design and management.
I did not put that on my
That's
list.
not on the list.
No,
Let's just go
I
through
di-
my
yeah,
list.
I disagree with
And if
that.
it's not on my list, it's
Yeah.
open to discussion. So
Okay.
the site access, that was that involves the landscaping and a lot of other.
Everything around the entrance.
Yeah,
Where are we now?
8.2.21,
Okay, so we're not doing parking, right?
right. 8.2.25, the special permit application process.
Well, I mean, partially, you could say that it's been satisfied, but then you have to go to 8.2.31.7
Right,
to
well-
finish it.
Yes.
Okay, so as long as we don't negate that, that's
Right,
fine.
exactly. 8.2.26, not an issue. 8.2.27, that's the number of copies and that type of
That's
thing.
done.
I didn't put 8.2.28 on there because
Oh.
it's really not applicable.
Right.
8.2.29 is not applicable, but, you know, again, these could come up, so they're not in my list.
Oh, yeah, that's definitely applicable.
Yeah. 8.2.30, we're done with our employment of outside consultants. And then 8.2.32, expansion. That's really not,
That goes without
Yeah.
saying.
yeah. And then annual reporting, those aren't really issues for now. So take 8.2.32 and 8.2.33 really shouldn't be on that list, but I think the others are all fine. Does everyone agree with that?
Yes.
Okay, well, I think now we can consider continuing our deliberations to
September 8th.
September 8th. And we could, at this juncture, if anyone has any strong feelings about how we should proceed on September 8th. I mean, because now we're coming down to the wire. I think on September 8th, I think we have to turn to the purposes of the senior housing bylaw and evaluate them, those purposes, and then turn to 8.2.31, and then 10.5.2. So I'm curious as to whether each person should make a statement as to whether they're convinced that the purposes have been satisfied, or whether we should just, as a group, try and summarize whether we think the purposes have been satisfied, and then turning to the findings that we have to make, whether each person should proceed down the list of findings and indicate whether they think the finding has been satisfied or not, and the reasons, brief reasons, why they think the way they do. Of course, as we go further down the road, you may agree with someone else, and so we can just, someone could say, I agree with so-and-so, and you wouldn't necessarily have to repeat things verbatim. But again, I'm really interested to hear from board members about how they would like to structure this last stage of our deliberations. I, in a sense, monopolized the first part of it with Emil's input. He and I did work together, and he had many good ideas, and I would have not done the job that I was able to do without his input. So, but this last stage, you know, it's fair game now. And how do you all perceive the most efficient and fair way of going forward?
So where does the unknowns fit in before we get to the,
Well, those are considerations that I think each board member needs to assess when they go to evaluate whether the applicant has satisfied the findings. So if that unknown is so important to you that it's a hold in terms of a finding, then that's where it fits in. if it's something that you say, well, you know, it's missing information, but there's so much additional information, I can still make a decision, one way or the other. So it fits in how you want it to fit in. That's
Right.
my take on it.
So Rick, are you advocating some sort of like a little bit of a crib sheet or a list for folks to be more methodical about it?
Well, it came up for discussion, and we had discussion about a list of probably half a dozen items. I didn't know if there were others that people wanted to bring up and have some discussion before we delved, so everybody had a chance to discuss the unknowns, or...
Well, we can continue the
Let me-
discussion of
let-
unknowns
let me just
before
finish.
we
Let me-
actually
Let me
start.
answer his question,
Okay.
so that we would have that discussion, then delve into answering the questions.
Yeah, I think
don't know what
I think I like that idea. I like the idea of people sort of sleeping on it a little bit and coming back. Maybe that's the first item in the agenda, is to revisit those unknowns.
And it doesn't have to be extensive.
No,
Just
no.
say, here are maybe no more than what's already on your list.
Yeah.
Actually, I was agreeing with you.
Yeah.
That's why I interrupted you to say, yes, let's do that first.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So we're all,
Yeah, I think
we're all
that-
on the same
I
page.
don't know what other board members feel, but I hear what Rick is saying, and I think it's a great idea.
Right, okay, so we'll do the unknowns.
And then I would advocate for a joint discussion of purposes, because the purposes are fairly broad in general, but the findings are pretty specific. And the bylaws tell us to weight the findings, so, and that's an individual, that's what your vote's based on, is your weighting of the findings. So that should be individual, not joint. That'd be how I would see it. So a joint discussion on, after you've reflected on unknowns, a joint discussion on that, anything missing, any new insights, and then a joint discussion on purposes, and then individual discussions on findings.
And we
So-
have to do both 8.2.31
And 10.5,
10.5.
yes, with his weighting the findings,
Most poorly worded.
yes. But maybe we could talk, maybe, should we read that and make sure we all agree what it means? Is it worth reading the words?
10.5.2?
Yes.
If you
Shall I
feel-
read them?
If you feel the need, please.
It's a question. Would that be valuable to the board?
Oh, yes, I think it would be. You know, 'cause
Thinking about the process then, so each individual would go through the findings one by one through 7. So they would speak for a period of time,
With a time limit.
time limit.
Yeah, definitely.
Yep.
Okay.
But that's
Uh,
reasonable.
Yeah, and then at the end, there would be a vote. You're not going to vote on item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it'd be one vote on the entire findings.
Yep.
Okay,
So that's your final vote.
that's your
Yes.
final
That's your
vote.
For the senior housing bylaw special permit,
and
for the
then
senior
we
housing
also
special
have to
permit.
vote on the,
Stormwater.
And that's a different deliberation, and we need to talk about how we're going to do that.
So I just want to confirm that the September 8th is a Thursday.
yes. Well, after we vote on the special permit, then we should turn and vote on the stormwater management application for a permit. If we don't vote on the stormwater management permit, if we don't do anything, then 90 days after when the evidence was closed on, I believe, July 26, it would be granted. So we have to vote one way or another on it to be,
Do we want to take that up on the meeting after September 8th?
I think that
I mean, we haven't
Yeah, we
gone
should-
through that bylaw to the extent that we have on the senior housing, so maybe we need to do the same, follow the same process, kind of just check it out.
I would also advocate that findings need to be
do
Pick-
it, you know,
picked up when fresh. Go ahead.
I think we might be able to proceed with the stormwater management after we take our vote. I don't know how long everyone will speak. It's one of the unknowns, how loquacious people will be in going through this process. So if it, for example, takes 2 hours to reach a vote on the special permit, we would have time to consider the stormwater management application. And the reason I bring this, I'll get my calendar out. We want to allow ourselves enough time to get a decision written, and then once the written decision is completed,
And filed.
well, no, not filed.
Oh.
Once the written decision is completed, I anticipate that the board then should have the opportunity to look at the decision that we intend to file, and if there are any errors, omissions, or anybody wants to change their vote or whatever, I don't think you could do that. I'm sure that might not, I don't know. Could you change your vote after reading the written decision? That's something for Robin Stein.
Yeah.
But anyhow, I think it would be only appropriate if board members were given the opportunity to review the written decision and make sure that it accurately reflects our deliberations. And then, following that, it would get filed with the clerk. So,
So that your information on the findings was accurate?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just to make sure that whatever statements are made in the decision, it's not something that any board member finds to be really erroneous and not reflective of our
Yeah.
discussions.
So for the purposes of, since we're getting down to some very weighty decision-making, it would be helpful if you actually outlined the things you just discussed, and then...
Oh, I can do that for our agenda.
And then send it around, so we know what our assignments are.
Yeah.
Everybody knows what their assignment is.
Well, so what I have now is that we will continue our discussion of the unknowns. We'll have a joint discussion of the purposes. Then each member will go through the findings in both section
yeah.
8.2.31
Yeah.
and 10.5.
Yeah,
And we'll do them sequentially.
yeah.
And summarize their views. And what I would urge everyone to do is to review as much of the record as possible. And of course, the closing statements that were submitted to us are very helpful. I don't know how copious your notes are from the different meetings, but to the extent we have minutes, I think that it's helpful to review them, and just whatever files you have to go through them, so you're as conversant as possible with all the relevant facts.
This sounds like a pretty bureaucratic problem for Patrick, because he's probably gonna have to send out copies of all of this stuff to each of us. Well,
No, because we all have it, Richard. I don't know if you do.
I don't
but
keep it all- I don't keep-
I have an office in my house that's,
Well, everybody's
every
been given
surface is
everything.
covered with a
Right,
file.
I understand.
Marnie,
That-
may I make another point? So if we're going to focus on findings, the very first sentence of 8.2.31, it says, "The findings below, in addition to the criteria set forth in section 825.2," and you go back, so that's another finding, you got to go back to there. And 825.2 takes you back to the open space preservation law.
Oh, yes.
So all of the findings under the OSFPD also have to be findings under the senior housing bylaw.
Or it only-
That's what I believe, that's how I read that.
Yeah, you're correct.
That's in addition to the below,
There's
which
a-
means that you go to 8.2.25 and it says,
They-
you have to go back to section 1. If the application contains an open space element, then the requirements of section 8.1
Yeah.
have to be met.
They-
So you
It
gotta
only-
meet
It
the,
only refers to the design process, though.
well, then, that,
They put an incorrect
We've
comma
talked
in
that,
there,
we've
so-
talked that around in circles.
I
So-
think there's an incorrect comma there. 'Cause that
What?
actually, I think the comma is incorrect. They said 8.1 comma, design review process, or open space bylaw. But
So,
okay. well,
so I think that,
they got two ways to read
I
it.
think the way I read it, and again, this, grammatically, this is problematic. So I think the intent was to identify what 8.1 is. And if you look, 8.1 is the name of the bylaw, Open
Right.
Space and Farmland Preservation Development. So the requirements of section 8.1, and then really it's the pre-application conference and the special permit design process. Because if we were to incorporate all the requirements of the open space and farmland development
Yeah.
preservation.
Okay, so it's just
I think there might be a mass
just
resignation
the
among the board members.
pre-application
To go back
conference
and do
and design process.
Just those
just
two
those two.
components,
It's
yes.
really the
Okay.
design standards.
Yeah, just the
Yes,
design.
just the design standards.
And that's a finding. We
Yes,
have
it
to
is a finding.
find
We have to
that the
find.
development meets those design standards.
Correct.
Okay. But that's
So-
another thing. We have the list of 7 there, but now we also have to add in the design standards from 8.1.
Well,
Okay.
that's actually number 7, too, if you look on the findings.
Yeah, is it?
It appears twice, yes.
Here's twice, so you can probably just do it once.
It's the final finding.
So just make sure that's clear in the directions that get sent out to all of us, so we get our homework straight.
Right. And so, Jonathan, did you want to read 10.5.2?
Well, would that be valuable to the board to discuss, or do we just
Could you
wanna-
tell us what it relates to?
Well, I think what we were just talking about is the task in doing the findings is we also have to weight the findings. And 10.5,
What is 10.5?
it's how to
No, what's 10?
It's special permits.
special permits, the special permit process.
Oh, okay, go ahead, thank you.
So, I mean, it just might be, if people don't have it in front of them. So 10.5.2, criteria. Special permits shall be granted by the SPGA unless otherwise specified herein only upon its written determination that the adverse effects of the proposed use will not outweigh its beneficial impacts to the town or neighborhood in view of the particular characteristics of the site and of the proposal in relation to that site, in addition to any specific requirements and factors that may be set forth in this bylaw. The determination shall include consideration of each of the following. Now, the question is, there's a 1 through 6, and I don't know whether I should read the 1 through 6. That seems sort of redundant to the purposes and the findings to go through those sequentially. I think the point of 10.5.2 is that weighting of the criteria. Does the good outweigh the bad, the benefit outweigh the adverse impacts?
That's not subjective at all.
Not at all. Why would we be here? So, anyway, it's our purpose in life. So,
So maybe, oh, excuse me.
So a good topic for discussion would be, in the mechanical aspects of each of our deliberations in doing the findings, do we want folks to go through these 1 through 6, which if you read them, I can read them, and you'll find that they overlap fully with purposes and findings. So it seems duplicative to have people give a full oration on 1 through 6. Shall I read them and you can decide?
Oh, no, I agree with, I think I understand where you're going.
Can you
So
give us, can
I
you give,
think that.
Do you have them in front of you, Rick?
no, can you give me the citation?
Sure, yeah. So I'll just read them super quick. So 1, social, economic, or community needs.
What I'm
No,
looking
sorry.
for is the numbers.
Oh, the numbers. It's 10.5.2, 1 through 6.
2. Okay, got it, thank you.
And the wording is literally a duplication of the wording found in findings and purposes. There's nothing in there that isn't elsewhere.
Okay.
I'd be ready for somebody to debate that with me, but that's my take on it.
Well, I think then what we can do is, with respect to 10.5.2, just indicate how we're weighing those criteria.
Exactly.
And if there's 1 or 2 in particular that is determining how you've weighed these considerations, you can mention.
Right,
But I
so-
don't think that any of us have to actually go through all of these, and it's probably going to be obvious after which way the wind will be blowing after we've gone through.
Yeah, it would be a duplication if you did 1 through 6 after we had a joint discussion of purposes and an individual discussion of findings.
Right, right.
But
got it.
the important part is the sentence that I did read, That's the important part that everybody needs to look at carefully when they do their findings,
Right,
because that's the criteria.
right. Right. So if we're fortunate, we will be able to deal with the stormwater management application as well.
Marty, can I ask a selfish question about schedule? I
Yeah.
don't know what we have on the books for September, the month of September. Obviously, next Thursday is the 8th.
Right,
It's also an Ipswich Planning Board hearing evening. I don't know if we have another meeting in September. We probably do.
20th.
The 20th, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe that's why we want to have it on the 8th. I guess I was wondering whether or not it'd be worth considering having it on the 13th instead, but I can make things work if
Oh,
it's-
alter the,
oh, do you
Instead of
have,
the 8th, having it on the 13th, if that's a consideration, a couple more days, it's a long weekend, it's the first week, whatever.
do you have a conflict then on the 8th?
I have a potential conflict with a planning board hearing in Ipswich, but it's not something I can get out of if it creates a bunch of heartache for this board. I don't want to inconvenience
Well,
everyone for
Then
one thing I can,
Then there's another, so that's one thing we could do.
yeah.
And then the other consideration is, I know Emil has vacation plans, so I don't know if anybody would have any strong feelings about moving the October 4th planning board meeting to October 11th.
Whoa, what happened to September now?
Well, what Pat is asking is that the September 8th meeting be moved to September 13th. So we would have planning board meetings on the 13th and 20th, and then on the 11th and 18th of October. Now, on the one hand, that seems like a kind of an inconvenience, but it might be helpful because we'll have things fresher in our minds than going for two weeks. So if we did the vote on the 13th, the meeting on the 20th might just be other board business, and then we would definitely have a draft decision by the 11th, and then we could finalize that decision, and it could be filed soon thereafter. The decision has to be filed absolutely no later than October 24th.
Maybe the draft could be made available prior to the meeting.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, and
So we would, if we voted on the 13th, we would obviously try and get a draft to everyone, say, by Friday the 7th.
First of all, I guess this is the 13th. Is that creating a bunch of hazard for everyone else? Because again, I could get out of the 8th thing probably. But if the board.
I'm okay with that. I don't
So
know.
are we doing the
Boards of-
13th and the 20th?
13th and the 20th,
Wait a minute, oh, that's September.
yep.
Yes.
Yeah, I got
And
both
then
those.
October 11th?
And the 18th.
And the 18th.
Jesus, you guys are gluttons for punishment.
There's another option could
Well-
be that we space it, so it's the 13th, the 27th, and the 11th, and that's following in every other week cadence, but you could do it back-to-back Tuesdays too, if it's,
And the 18th, right?
the 18th would be in the next,
Let me
I'm
just,
okay, I'm
let
moving
me
the
just
schedule,
check one thing before I commit to all this.
moving it all around, but I'm open to anything. Just wanted to put out there the 13th would be better than the 8th for me.
That could be a troublemaker, huh?
Actually, moving the planning board meeting from October 4th is something that's meaningful for me,
Okay.
and probably some of the participants as well, because October 4th is the beginning of Yom Kippur, so that's a terrible time to have a planning board meeting.
Agreed.
It's really disrespectful for our Jewish citizens. So we should move the October 4th meeting to October 11th, clearly. Does anyone have a problem with that?
October 11th is fine.
Okay, so we're all agreed. Here's the schedule, September 13th
Right.
and September 20th,
Right.
October 11th and October 18th.
Okay.
And we've accommodated everyone.
Great.
Appreciate that.
Good.
Good.
Okay, so I will get this agenda, if you will, with our,
Oh.
how we're going to proceed. I'll get that to Patrick before our next meeting, and I can
Marty.
expand upon it if necessary.
One sec. I don't know if you can hear me, Marnie.
Yes, I
Yeah.
can.
Okay, one quick reminder, in addition, and we discussed this at the last meeting, but in addition to what's in the zoning bylaw, Chapter 48, Section 9 requires that special permits may be issued only for uses which are in harmony with the general purpose and intent of the bylaw. Just language to keep in mind from the statute. And then also a question, I guess, to the board, if you think you're moving towards findings and a vote at the next meeting, do you also want to be working on potential conditions? I know a lot of things were discussed tonight and Patrick's working on that. But is that something else you want to include in the discussion?
We could certainly do that. Are you working on conditions, Patrick?
Yes.
Then you should get them to us as soon as possible, and we would then have to add that,
Because those conditions could be adding to the known unknowns.
we will have to then do, unknowns/conditions or
Unknown
something like
knowns.
that.
I don't know about that.
I'll get my dog in here, she'll help.
That was all I had, thank you.
So we have to close the hearing.
Well, the hearing is already closed. You can continue your deliberations.
We need to
Oh,
continue
sorry,
the deliberations. So at this juncture, I think we have accomplished everything I set out to do. I think we should be somewhat proud of ourselves. And I can entertain a motion to continue our deliberations until, where's my calendar?
13th.
September 13th
7
At
a.m.
7 p.m.
7 p.m., yeah.
at 7 p.m. And it will
Mark,
be the
You set
same-
up in person and everyone else by Zoom?
Yes, the same methodology as we're employing now. The board will meet in the memorial room, and the public is invited to view our deliberations via Zoom. So do I have a motion to continue our deliberations?
I move that we continue our deliberation till September 13th.
Second?
When I call your name, please indicate that you are on board with continuing our deliberations to September 13th at 7 p.m. Rick Mitchell,
Aye.
Richard Boroff,
Aye.
Jonathan Poor,
Aye.
Emil Dahlquist,
Aye.
Bill Wheaton,
Aye.
Pat Norton,
Aye.
and Marnie Crouch, aye. And now, I can entertain a motion to adjourn.
So,
I move that we adjourn.
I second.
When I call your name. Rick Mitchell, Richard Boroff,
Aye.
Aye.
Jonathan Poor,
Aye.
Emil Dahlquist,
Aye.
Bill Wheaton,
Aye.
and Marnie Crouch, aye. I think, Pat, you get to vote on adjournment.
No, I support the decision, Will.